question is that this bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The purpose of the Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Bill is to establish a new regulatory framework to promote and regulate the nuclear safety of activities relating to AUKUS submarines. This includes establishing a new independent regulator to be known as the Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Regulator. The impetus for the bill stems from the AUKUS partnership, a trilateral security pact between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. This partnership includes the development and deployment of nuclear-powered submarines. Such will necessitate stringent safety protocols and regulatory oversight. Deputy Speaker, transparency and accountability are key to social licence for any significant government endeavour. In this biggest of national endeavours, transparency and accountability are sadly lacking. Instead, we're seeing an initial piece of legislation about the AUKUS scheme which really relates to its back end, and even this seems premature given the very real and outstanding questions regarding Australia's readiness for any form of nuclear capacity. I'm concerned that this Parliament has not had an opportunity for a detailed and transparent inquiry into AUKUS, into its rationale and its costs, and the implications for nuclear proliferations for Australia, even just related to the questions related to safe handling and storage of nuclear waste. Naval nuclear power potentially offers this country significant and strategic and operational advantages, and I'm not saying that I'm opposed to the AUKUS scheme, but it also comes with significant risks which require careful management. It is an ongoing concern, for one, that all our oversight and regulation of AUKUS will be through defence, which does, after all, have a very significant stake in its success. An independent overseer of the safety aspects of AUKUS, such as UPHANSA, which has decades of relevant expertise and experience, but no conflict of interest, might well be more appropriate. Nuclear-powered submarines are obvious targets for terrorist attacks or other hostile actions. It's vital that from day one of the program we ensure the security of the vessels and of their nuclear materials. It's also vital that we ensure the safety of waste disposal sites. Addressing these risks involves a combination of rigorous safety protocols, continuous training, robust regulatory oversight and effective emergency preparedness plans. Any doubt regarding those measures will impact significantly on the social licence of the AUKUS scheme in Australia. The operation of nuclear reactors on submarines involves the handling of radioactive materials. Ionising radiation can be harmful, even rapidly fatal, to humans and to other living organisms. Despite even the most stringent of safety measures, the possibility of accidents can never be entirely eliminated. Incidents such as reactor malfunctions, leaks or collisions could well lead to the release of radioactive materials. This would pose immediate and severe risks to submarine crews, nearby human populations and the environment. These concerns are not academic. Let's not forget that since 1945 the USA has lost no fewer than 3 atomic bombs, and that since 1950 there have been at least 32 so-called broken arrow incidents in which nuclear weapons have either been dropped by mistake or jettisoned in an emergency setting by American forces. And that's just the US. We have no similar accounting for the UK, for France, for China or for Russia. We do know that Russia has lost several nuclear devices off submarines, but we don't know much more than that. In this country, just last year, we saw a radioactive capsule literally fall off the back of a truck. Australians deserve full clarity about the safety of all aspects of any or all nuclear programs in this country. When submarines are decommissioned, the radioactive reactor compartments and spent fuel have to be safely disposed of. Nuclear waste remains hazardous for thousands of years. Accidents during the handling, the transport or storage of nuclear waste can lead to the immediate release of radioactive materials which will have severe, immediate and long-term public health and environmental consequences. The storage and disposal of radioactive waste from Australia's nuclear-powered submarines will require dedicated facilities and highly trained staff. We have to have surety in the processes of waste transport in sealed and secure containers to storage or disposal facilities. We will need purpose-built facilities for interim storage and then for permanent disposal of that radioactive waste, including spent fuel. For the moment, the Anstow nuclear facility at Lucas Heights in New South Wales, which has safely and securely managed low-level radioactive waste in Australia for decades, is probably the best place to put Australia's nuclear waste until we have an agreed and integrated management approach. However, at this point we have no information regarding planning processes for long-term management options of high-level nuclear waste. Previous attempts to find permanent sites for even just our low-level nuclear waste have been unsuccessful. Most recently, the failed attempt to build a dump at Kimber in South Australia. We've now signalled our intent to construct a storage facility for high-grade nuclear waste. That's a facility which will need to be robust for over 1,000 years. This has not been previously achieved by Australia, the US or the UK. Both US and the UK have had nuclear submarines for decades. Neither has yet worked out a permanent solution for their high-grade nuclear waste from those submarines. As of June 2023, the UK had failed to dispose of any of its 22 retired nuclear-powered submarines. It stores them in designated dockyards at a cost of at least £30 million every year. A high-level radioactive waste disposal facility, which is now nearing completion in Finland, has cost €1 billion already, and the estimated cost of the UK's geological facility for intermediate and high-level waste disposal is over £20 billion. In March 2023, the Defence Minister told Australia that we would build a facility on defence land with the aim of storage and disposal of dismantled reactors, high-level radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel. He said in March 2023 that the processes by which this facility would be identified and built would be given to us within a year. That was 18 months ago, and we're still waiting. We really have no reason to feel faith in this government's ability to do better than the US or the UK. It feels very premature to commit to this program when we have no immediate prospect of being able to deliver effective and safe disposal of long-term nuclear waste. I do note that the cost of building this high-level storage facility in Australia has not been included in the $368 billion budget for AUKUS at this point. I do note that in 2016, a South Australian Royal Commission estimated the total capital and operating cost of a high-level nuclear disposal facility to be $145 billion over the 120-year life of that facility. Deputy Speaker, I'm glad to see that the government has this week responded to the concerns raised by the Senate committee into this matter by amending their legislation so that it allows only the storage and disposal of spent nuclear fuel from Australian submarines. Those assurances, however, relate only to high-level radioactive waste. We have an ongoing concern that through this legislation, Australia could become a dumping ground for low and intermediate level waste from nuclear waste from the US and the UK. And those concerns have not at this point been addressed or assuaged by the Minister in his responses to questions about the issue. Australians already lack certainty about the potential risks of the AUKUS agreement. Recently, we learned that either or both of the US or the UK could terminate their current commitments under the scheme with as little as 1 year's notice. We also learned that Australia has agreed to take responsibility for nuclear safety risks and that we will indemnify the US and the UK against any liability, loss, costs, damage or injury arising from the nuclear risks as connected with the design, the manufacture, the assembly, transfer or utilisation of any of the materials or equipment involved in the submarine program. This is an extraordinary one-sided agreement. We seem to have surrendered a significant degree of our national military sovereignty. The health, environmental and economic consequences of any accidents or adverse events arising from this program could be extreme. Deputy Speaker, the way in which this government is presenting isolated components of the AUKUS scheme to this House in this manner is depriving the country of an opportunity to look at its bigger picture. We all want to see effective and cost-efficient defence procurement. We all want to be sure that our government is making good decisions in our best national interest. But too many questions about the AUKUS program remain unanswered. Will we ever see these promised submarines? When? At what cost? And at what opportunity cost? Will the submarines still be fit for purpose if and when they are received? Can we adequately staff the submarines? And can we provide the technological support required to safely run them? How and where will the waste from this program be stored? How much nuclear waste from the US or the UK might be dumped on us? How much will the storage of waste from this program cost us? These are the bigger questions that the government is not putting on the table with this incomplete, sketchy bit of legislation. The people of Australia deserve greater transparency about this very important issue.
The question is that this bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. What this bill seeks to do, and with support from both Labor and the Coalition, is pass legislation that can make anywhere in Australia a nuclear waste dumping ground with no requirement for public consultation, no First Nations input and no warning. The bill allows the Defence Minister the power to designate anywhere in Australia a high-level nuclear dumping ground with no public consultation needed. Under this bill, the supposed independent regulator of defence can be staffed by the defence personnel and report to the Minister of Defence, unlike in other countries where nuclear waste has a truly independent regulator. Under this bill, the same minister would be responsible for the nuclear submarines as for the regulation of nuclear waste, which is a clear conflict of interest. Australia should not be a dumping ground for nuclear byproducts of the US or the UK. And this runs roughshod over not only local communities, who will have no say over whether or not their community becomes a dumping ground for high-level nuclear waste as a result of the AUKUS program, but also First Nations peoples who have a long history of protecting their land from nuclear waste from McCarty to Kimber. We'll have more to say on this we've had more to say this in the dissenting report, but it's worth noting that previously, the Greens raised concerns that the original version of this bill would have allowed the UK and the US to dump high-level nuclear waste in Australia. And when we raised this issue, we were told that we were fear-mongering. And now we find that, in fact, it was entirely correct. Entirely correct. So you can forgive us for not particularly trusting this next version of the bill and whether or not it will also see high-level nuclear waste or lower-level nuclear waste from the United States or the UK dumped somewhere in Australia without any recourse to object to that. But let's be clear about this and what this is doing. This is facilitating the $368 billion AUKUS nuclear sub-program, which ultimately is about facilitating the imperial ambitions of the United States in the Asia-Pacific. Let's be very clear about this. This has absolutely nothing to do with Australian security. Zero, none, absolutely not at all. And in fact, what this program does is make us less safe and drag us into a potential war in Asia. It's sort of incredible, actually, just how subservient Australia and the Labor Party are being to the United States in this instance. $368 billion, where we may not actually see any nuclear submarines over the next 30 years. It's an entirely one-sided agreement that hands over Australia's ability to determine its own future to the United States. In fact, United States officials won't even confirm that Australia will have complete control over the deployment of these nuclear submarines.
That is rubbish.
It's entirely true. But look, it's good to see that we're uniting the Labor and Liberal Party, the true coalition in this place. There are multiple get-out-of-jail-free cards for the US under this agreement. If at any point the US thinks that providing nuclear submarines to Australia would not be in their interest, they can just pack up their bags and leave, taking all their tech and all their money with them. This is deeply concerning, as Australia has already begun paying the US and UK nearly $10 billion in public funds. If the US and UK withdraw, they have the right to take back and or destroy all material and information provided, and the UK and the US only need provide 1 year's notice. The agreement also puts Australia on the hook to indemnify the UK and the US for any liability, loss, costs, damage or injury associated with the use of the nuclear submarines. That means if something goes wrong with one of the US second-hand nuclear submarines, it is Australia that is liable. Again, this would be a sick joke if it weren't so serious, and the consequences of a nuclear disaster so serious. The UK and US will even be allowed to determine the price of highly enriched uranium it is selling to Australia. It also allows the US and UK to intervene in Australia's relations with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Australia gets a guarantee of nothing. We have no recourse if the US walks away. We don't get independent consultation with the IAEA. We don't get fair prices for the fuel. We don't even get a guarantee of nuclear submarines. But if the whole thing blows up in our face and something goes wrong, then we are financially responsible to the UK and the US. This is the deal of the century for the US and the UK, who must be chuckling all the way to the bank that they've found an Albanese Labor government who's willing to dish out hundreds of billions of dollars to the United States and the UK for their own imperial ambitions. On average, this will cost $12 billion a year for the next 30 years, in the middle of a cost of living and housing crisis. Like, it is genuinely remarkable that imagine what $12 billion a year could do to tackle the housing crisis. Imagine how many hundreds of thousands of good public homes. What if we put our industrial capacity and our creative capacity not to helping the US facilitate another disastrous war, but instead towards helping these people in this country? Building enough homes, making sure we got dental and mental health into Medicare, transitioning to 100% renewable energy, creating new industries that create wealth in this country. Instead, we're dishing out hundreds of billions of dollars to the United States so they can project more power into the Asia Pacific and make us all less safe. Like, let's be very clear about this. If the ultimate outcome of all of this is a war with China, we lose. We lose. And there's this flippant way that the political class in this country talks about war. As if let's just continue to fund and expand the US's imperial ambitions in the Asia Pacific and help and create and enhance tensions, as if this is some game. Well, the consequences of war for future generations in the Asia Pacific are devastating. No one wins. Hundreds of, if not in future, millions of people dead. Sons and daughters sent to war for what? For a war created by the tensions created by political decisions like this. And has the Australian political class learnt nothing? I note that there's a Liberal member in this place who had a bit of a go at me then. Well, the Liberal Party in this place has never reckoned with the disastrous invasion of Iraq and back in the United States and that. Never reckoned with the disastrous invasion of Afghanistan. 1 million dead in Iraq. Oh, and what did you do there? So the Australia went to war in Iraq, again, backing the imperial ambitions of the United States. What did we end up with when you invaded Iraq? ISIS. Yeah, great work. Really good work. That's a fantastic foreign policy decision. What about Afghanistan? Trillions of dollars ended up being spent there in that disastrous war with the stated intention of getting rid of the Taliban. And what do we end up with 20 years later? After death and destruction and more international instability, we were left with a more radical Taliban. What is it going to take for the Labor and Liberal Party to realise that tying ourselves to the hip of the United States and participating in their disastrous war that never about peace or security and always about their own foreign policy ambitions, render us less safe, cost us money and precious lives? What is it going to take? And at the end of the day, what we eschew, what we abandon is the capacity for Australia to pursue its own independent foreign policy. We could be a proud middle power that pursues and facilitates peace in the world. Instead, what we're doing is surrendering entirely our foreign policy to the interest of the United States, despite the fact that every time Australia has done that, every time Australia has participated in an overseas war, it has led to death and destruction and less international security, making us less safe, losing our men and women, dying in wars that they should not have been sent to, costing the country billions of dollars and leaving the world a less and more dangerous place.
The question is that the bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Fisher.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. And if you want an example of why you should not vote for the Greens, we just heard one from the member for Griffith. I want to give the member for Griffith and anybody who is even contemplating voting for the Greens at the next election or in any election a bit of a history lesson. It's called 1942. Oh my God. And in 1942, we faced an existential threat. Now, our traditional ally in 1942, up until 1942, was Mother England. But the Labor government at the time, rightfully in my view, as a result of the fall of Singapore, Australia was in great peril. And who came to the aid of Australia? Who was it? US. It was the United States. The United States came to the aid of Australia in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Thousands of Marines from across mainland United States came to a place that they had never heard of to fight a war that they really didn't have a fight in, and thousands of them died. Thousands of them died. Thousands of them fought to defend Australia. The Battle of Milne Bay, the Battle of the Coral Sea, changed the face of the Second World War, but for the actions of the United States in literally saving Australia, Australia would look very, very different today. But the Greens would have you believe that all of that is in the past, that we ought not even consider these things. Well, I can tell you, Madam Deputy Speaker, my grandfather served in World War II, served on HMAS Canimbla. And I grew up as a young boy constantly hearing these words, this sentence. It's really simple. Thank God for the Yanks. Thank God for the Yanks. I grew up hearing that time and time again, because the reality is Australia in 1942 could not defend itself.
So you're basing a foreign policy in 1942?
Today, in 2024, Australia can't defend itself. Now, that is a shameful position to be in. But the reality is, peer on peer, if we were to face a peer competitor, Australia would not be able to defend itself on its own in the same way that we were not able to defend ourselves in 1942. Now, they say if you refuse to look at history, you're destined to repeat it. And if we did what the Greens did, and is in their political manifesto, and decimate the Australian Defence Force, because that's exactly what the Greens want to do. At a time when we live in the most geopolitically unstable period since 1945, the Greens want to decimate the ADF. That's what they want to do. They want to decimate the ADF. They want to rip the guts out of funding for it. They don't believe in defence. They don't believe in ADF personnel. It's very clear. I'd love to know how many Greens members are protesting. I'm surprised you're here today and not in Melbourne. I'm surprised that the member for Griffith is here and not in Melbourne, supporting his mates throwing rocks at Vicpol. But I digress, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I apologise for digressing, because the member for Griffith winds me up, because the member for Griffith and people like him have no appreciation for history, have no appreciation for the loss and sacrifice that our generations before us have made. They just think that this democracy that we live in today just kind of appeared. The loss, the lives in which we enjoy today in this country came off the back of servicemen and women from Australia, from New Zealand, from Canada, from Great Britain, from the United States. It didn't just happen. It's because countries like us stood up against tyranny in both World War I and World War II and said, we will not stand for this. We know it's going to cost money, it's going to cost lives, more importantly, but it's when countries do not stand up against that sort of tyranny that the world falls apart. But the Greens, it's all peace, love and mung beans, baby.
Yeah, peace is terrible.
It's all peace, love and mung beans. And it doesn't matter, because the world is a beautiful place.
So you're against peace?
The world is a beautiful place. Try telling that to the Ukrainians. Try telling that to the Israelis. Try telling that to so many other countries who have been violated and invaded and attacked. Life just doesn't work like that. In a nirvana, you know, it would be wonderful if we didn't have to have... Be wonderful, wouldn't it, Opposition Treasurer, if you didn't have to find the sort of money that we have to find to fund our Defence Force. In a nirvana, it would be perfect. But you know what? We don't live in nirvana. We live in a world, sadly, where we have people like the President of Russia who has invaded Ukraine.
What has that got to do with AUKUS?
He has invaded Ukraine. President Xi has told his senior military to be prepared to take Taiwan by force, if necessary, by 2027. That is why, hopefully this bloke at the next election will need to find the money to fund AUKUS. And that is why Jim Chalmers, the member for... what's his electorate? The current Treasurer has to find the money to fund AUKUS. Because parties of government have a responsibility to ensure the peace and security of this country. Parties like the Greens, Independents, they can promise the world and give you an atlas. Promise the world and give you an atlas. But sadly, we live in a world which is, as I said, it is the most geopolitically unstable. Almost everybody agrees with that since 1945. That is why this bill, that is why AUKUS is so incredibly important. It's not just about nuclear-powered submarines. There is so much more to AUKUS than submarines. And I welcome the Defence Minister into the chamber because we've just had a wonderful exchange between myself and the member for Griffith about the need for the ADF, the need to properly equip the ADF with some of the most stealthy submarines that are available today. And I reminded the Defence Minister, I reminded the member for Griffith that peace comes at a price. Peace comes at a price. There's an very old phrase that has been bandied around for millennia. You know the phrase, don't you?
We hate mung beans.
The phrase goes something like, if you want peace, prepare for war.
You see what happened with the peace through war thing?
Nothing more.
If you want peace, prepare for war. If you want to provoke your enemies, then be weak.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what would happen. That is exactly what would happen if the Greens ever had control over the government Treasury benches. And we face a very real prospect. And I'm really pleased that the Minister for Defence is in here right now because I earnestly believe, and I'm probably going to regret saying this in public, I earnestly believe that the Minister for Defence is a good man. It's true. It's true. It's true. I do believe he's a good man. I do believe he has the interests of this country at heart. But
you guys will be in coalition before you're in anybody's in coalition.
We face a very real prospect at the next election that Labor and the Greens will be in some sort of a power-sharing arrangement.
That's it.
It'll be a power-sharing arrangement. It'll be a coalition.
What a shocker.
God knows Minister for Defence, this bloke could be the new Defence Minister.
The Treasurer.
He could be the new Defence Minister. He could be the new Defence Minister because he's so committed to the defence of this country. And the Greens, they will say to the Prime Minister, if it comes to this, if you want to remain Prime Minister, you need to have us at the cabinet table, you need to have us at the policy sharing table, the formulation of policy. The Greens will exact a very, very heavy price, Minister for Defence. You know that. I know that. We know that on this side. The Greens will exact a very heavy price on this government. And you know what? I hope we win the next election. I really do. I hope we do. That's what we're fighting for. But you know what? If we don't win it, I hope you win, that the Labor Party win in majority government, because the worst thing that could ever happen to this place, to this country, is if you guys are ever in a power-sharing arrangement with the Labor Party. God help us. God help this country. If the Greens are ever sharing power with the Labor Party again, just like they did in the last Labor Party, the last Labor government, God help us. God help us. And I'm making a plea to anybody who's watching this, anybody who's even thinking remotely about voting for the Greens. In the words of President Biden, don't do it, because you will significantly weaken the defence capabilities of this country. It would not even surprise me. And the region. It would not even surprise me if this government came under pressure on all things that we don't want to see. So I also want to encourage the government not to accept preferences from the Greens and the member for Griffith, et al. Because, for the reasons which I've outlined, a power-sharing arrangement between the Greens and the government, which would only come into force by virtue of a preference arrangement. You know, I've sat and watched in the chamber for weeks and months, watched the government and the Greens fight over, over this, that and everything. But if the government is so against what the Greens have been doing in recent times, particularly in relation to Gaza, then the Labor Party should stand up and say, well, you know what? Just as they said to us decades ago, you shouldn't accept preferences from one nation, I say to the Labor Party, you shouldn't accept preferences from this mob, because they will bring you down. Sure as God made little green apples, this lot will bring you down. And not only will they bring you down, they will make this country a far less safe place than what it is, both culturally, both defence-wise and certainly economically. We cannot afford a situation where these guys get anywhere near the Treasury benches, because it will ruin this country. So anybody who's listening to this on the radio or watching this, you probably need to get a life, but I would encourage you, please don't support the Greens.
I put the question that this bill now be read a second time. All those in favour say aye. Sum up first. Yes.
Thank you. So firstly, can I thank all members who have contributed to the debate on these amendments, particularly having heard the last speech. Thank the member for making that speech. Clearly I chose the wrong tie today. It's a sign. I'd also like to thank the opposition for its bipartisanship and support in progressing these bills through the Parliament. These bills are the critical next legislative step in establishing the highest standards of nuclear safety and stewardship of Australia's future conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine enterprise under the banner of AUKUS. The government has listened closely to the contributions of those who have engaged in the consultation processes around these bills, including through the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Legislation Committee. That committee considered the bills and made 7 recommendations to improve the bill, ultimately recommending that the bill be passed. And the government has accepted either in full or in principle all of those recommendations, and I can foreshadow that in a moment I will shortly move amendments to address these. The government thanks the committee for its work in thoroughly considering the bills and acknowledges all those that supported the inquiry process. The Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Bill 2023 will establish a new fit-for-purpose regulatory framework, including an independent regulator, the Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Regulator, for nuclear safety within Australia's conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine enterprise and capability lifecycle. This new framework will be harmonised with other schemes, including those relating to work, health and safety, nuclear non-proliferation and civilian nuclear safety. This new regulator will have a range of functions and comprehensive powers and will work with existing regulators to promote the safety of our submariners, Australian international communities and the environment. The Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Transitional Provisions Bill supports the transition between the existing regulatory regime and the new regulatory framework that will be established through the Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Act on commencement, designed specifically to regulate nuclear safety aspects of naval and nuclear propulsion and the nuclear-powered submarine enterprise. Throughout the development of the legislation, the government has demonstrated a clear commitment to consultation, engaging with targeted stakeholders across state government, local councils, unions, industry, First Nations representative bodies, relevant Commonwealth and state agencies, academia and training providers. We welcome all these contributions and encourage engagement as we proceed. This commitment will continue as we progress further on the pathway to acquiring nuclear-powered submarine capability for our nation. These bills are critical to Australia's acquisition of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines, and I commend these bills to the House.
Thank you, Minister. I now put the question that this bill now be read a second time. All those in favour say aye. All those against say no. Ayes have it. Excellent. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. I call the clerk.
Government business order of the day number 4, Australian Naval Nuclear Power Safety Transitional Provisions Bill 2023, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill now be read a second time. There are no speakers. Second bill. This is the second bill. The question is, I now put the question that this bill now be read a second time. All those in favour say aye. All those against? No. Say no. I think the ayes have it. Yeah. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. I call the clerk.
Government business order of the day number 5, Treasury Laws Amendment Reserve Bank Reforms Bill 2023, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is this bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Hume.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to resume the speech that I had begun down in the other chamber, and where I had laid out our strong commitment to an independent, credible, capable Reserve Bank. And it's very clear that those opposite don't share that commitment. I had also said that we consider completely unacceptable a strategy from those opposite to sack and stack the Reserve Bank Board to serve their own purposes. And it has become very clear, very apparent that not only are they not committed to an independent, credible, capable Reserve Bank, they are committed to sacking and stacking the current board because this is a treasurer who learned his trade from Wayne Swan, the president of the Labor Party, from Paul Keating, whose view of the Reserve Bank was they do as they're told. They do as they're told. And of course what happens with Labor treasurers is they lose control over the economy, they lose control over inflation, growth stops, it shudders to a halt, and they want to be able to control the Reserve Bank for their political purposes in the lead up to an election. Now when it wrecks the economy, when they've got their foot on the accelerator, for instance, when the Reserve Bank has the foot on the brake, the engine stalls, but they don't care. No. They don't care as long as they can serve their own political purposes. And let me tell you, this Treasurer and this Prime Minister are only about the politics, Deputy Speaker. They are only about the politics. They couldn't care less what implications it has for the engine when their foot's on the accelerator as the Reserve Bank's foot is on the brake. And we saw that in comments that were made over the last week. Extraordinary comments. Well, it all started, the person who let out, of course, was the Treasurer. He let out before he set the dogs out, the rest of them, his surrogates. He started by blaming the RBA for all of his woes. They're his woes. It's his economic, it's his economic disaster that's hurting Australian households, that's seen their standard of living collapse since he has been the Treasurer. But he went and he said, well, I'm going to shift the blame to the Reserve Bank. I'm going to find an excuse because it's the Reserve Bank smashing the economy, he said. It's all them. Backed in by the Prime Minister. Backed in by the Prime Minister. Backed in by the other members of the government front bench. I'm sure the member opposite agrees with him. Backed in by those Labor-aligned commentators like Stephen Conroy, Stephen Koukoulas. They all backed him in, and then backed in on Friday by the ALP president, his mentor, ALP President Wayne Swan, who said he was very disappointed in the Reserve Bank and that, wait for it, it was punching itself in the face. Extraordinary comments from a former Treasurer. Shows a complete disrespect and disregard for an institution that has served this country well. That is not perfect, but has served this country well as a country that over multiple decades has had stronger growth and lower inflation than almost any other country in the world. But this is their view, and it's because it's not serving their political purpose. At the end of the day, that's where they come out. But it goes even deeper than those comments from the ALP president, because shocking quotes that came out from an ABC report by Jacob Grieber, where he revealed one senior Labor figure described the RBA to the ABC on Friday as barbarians, weirdos, in thrall of a bizarre groupthink, and that the governor is a nutter. These are the comments. I hope those opposite don't agree with these comments, but these are the comments from a senior Labor figure reported by a very credible economic commentator, Jacob Grieber, and it truly is shocking. Now, the idea that what you do in the week leading up to introducing legislation that they want bipartisanship... No, that those opposite... I'll take the interjection. Those opposite are bringing in a new piece of legislation to reform the Reserve Bank that allows them to sack and stack the board. In the week leading up to that, you send the dogs out, you send the surrogates out to say that the Reserve Bank is filled with barbarians, weirdos, bizarre groupthink, and the governor is a nutter. I mean, what sort of an outfit is this? It's an economic joke. What sort of a treasurer is this? He is helpless and hapless.
Yes, the member for Moreton.
You to ask the member for Hume to not reflect on the Treasurer when today he clearly indicated he had nothing to do with the statements that the member for Hume is connecting him to. He's misleading the Fed chamber completely.
I think the member for Hume is referring to comments other than those made by the Treasurer.
No, he then connected it directly to the Treasurer.
Ask the member to continue.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I connected it to a senior Labor figure. I certainly hope it wasn't the member opposite who said these things. I certainly hope not. Perhaps he can clarify that at some point, but I certainly hope it wasn't either of the members opposite who said this, but they did call the Reserve Bank, a bunch of barbarians, weirdos, in thrall of a bizarre groupthink, and the governor is a nutter. I mean, truly extraordinary. Now, it is clear that the attacks on the Reserve Bank were led out by the Treasurer. That's beyond. That's the time sequence. That's how he led them out, and out went the surrogates, out went the proxies, out they went, attacking this institution. And at the end of the day, we know what they're really on about. What they're really on about is two things. One is shifting the blame for their failures. A 9% reduction in Australian standard of living. A collapse in Australian standard of living. No other OECD country has seen it. Michael Reid at the AFR laid this out just a short time ago. No other OECD country in the world has seen a collapse in their standard of living like Australia in the last 2 years. And it's extraordinary how unlucky Labor governments always are, aren't they? Terribly unlucky. They wreck the economy every single time. Every single time. Every single time they do it. Worst in the OECD. We've got inflation, which is stuck. Core inflation, Deputy Speaker, since January has not moved. Has not moved. And there is not a single advanced country in the world other than Australia where inflation hasn't moved during this year, since January this year. We are the only one. We are at the back of the pack every single time. Our inflation is higher than any of those other countries, those advanced countries in the world. We're at the back of the pack in dealing with it. And so the answer for the Treasurer, the answer for those opposite, is to shift the blame to the RBA and then to try to seize control, which no doubt will lead where it always leads with Labor, wrecking the institution and wrecking the economy. Labor's plan is clear to see. And let's look at the economists' reaction. Let's look at the economists' reaction to the war that Labor is waging against the RBA. RMIT economics professor Sinclair Davison, well respected, he said this: all the economic indicators are going the wrong way. All the economic indicators are going the wrong way. And what is the government doing? Fighting with the RBA. Former RBA board member, highly respected former board member Warwick McGibbon, said, "You want to think that the government and the central bank are working together in the same direction for the benefit of the country. You want to think that." To make those sorts of comments made by the Treasurer and others, suggested that maybe there's some other agendas at work. We know what they are, and that's not helpful, he goes on to say. And another former RBA board member, Graham Craig, said, for the Treasurer to then come out saying, well, this is the Reserve Bank's fault, I don't think a serious economist in the country would agree with that. Well, I can assure you, Deputy Speaker, this Treasurer is not a serious economist. He is a doctor of spin, not a doctor of economics. Doctor, he likes to call himself, of course, but it's not of economics, and Graham Cray has made the point that there's no serious economist that would back in what the Treasurer has said. The truth is, what's sitting behind this is Labor's failed economic management. Labor's failed economic management. And we only have to look at the facts to see how bad it's been for Australians. Those opposite like to pat themselves on the back. They like to say how good Australians have got it. Every single day we hear them say this. But let's look at the facts. Living standards, real disposable incomes have fallen since Labor came to power by 8.7%. Our those little gold coin, it's worth almost 10% less than when those opposite came to power. That's what you get with Labor. That's what you get with Labor. Aspiration dies, hope dies. Australians, understandably, are seeing less and less light at the end of the tunnel as things continue to get worse. Labor productivity has collapsed by 6.3%. There is no pathway to prosperity without Labor productivity. None. Now, Paul Keating actually understood that. But Paul Keating is at war with this Treasurer. Everyone's at war with the Treasurer now. The Productivity Commission, the RBA, most economists around the country, and of course He, on the other hand, has failed to win the war against inflation and certainly hasn't won the war on productivity, which has collapsed by 6.3%. Household savings are down by over 10 percentage points. Australians are giving up hope. They're cracking open the big piggy bank because they've run out of anything else. And so they've essentially stopped saving under this government because they have to make ends meet. Personal income taxes are 25% higher than when Labor came to power. Now, Chris Richardson makes this point, that inflation, and we have had raging inflation over the last 2 years, which was at its highest level since Labor has been in power.
Shame.
Prime Minister should take note of that. Prime Minister should take note of that. But inflation is terrible for households. It's terrible for households. It drives up interest rates, it drives up the cost of living, of course, and it drives up taxes being paid, and it drives bracket creep, which means your tax rate goes up as well. Interest paid on mortgages has almost tripled, and the economy is experiencing the slowest GDP growth. Indeed, since the 1990s, indeed the 6 quarters of GDP per capita going backwards. That's the household recession. Yep. Households have seen their GDP per person going backwards for 6 consecutive quarters, which is absolutely extraordinary. Now, in the 50 years since they've been keeping data, we haven't seen that before. And 50 years ago, a long time ago, ABBA had just put out Waterloo. The Rubik's Cube had just been invented. The Fonz had just appeared on our TV screens in happy days. They were happier days. It was under Gough Whitlam, but they were happier days today, I have to say. But the truth is, it's a long, long time where we haven't seen anything like what we are seeing today. And you see a lot of economists talking about the desperate situation with our economy that came out in the national accounts just last week. Warren Hogan said we're going backwards in terms of our living standards, our productivity is falling, our government is growing, and if this is our new economy, this might be the 4th economy, then our standards of living are one of the world's wealthiest countries is going to go away. KPMG's chief economist, Brendan Rinn, has this to say: the public sector has its foot on the accelerator and the Reserve Bank's foot is on the brake. It's stalling the economy. In effect, this is coming from Brendan Rinn. In effect, we're in no man's land. He's saying it too. It's a good line. It's a good line. Government spending is not sustainable and is effectively taking from Peter to pay Paul. From Peter to pay Paul. Brendan Rinn goes on to say, whilst there's this idea that government spending has saved the economy, what it's effectively done is just move the deck chairs around. That's what those opposite like to do. They certainly want to do that with the Reserve Bank, don't they? They do. Move some deck chairs around there, get rid of the people they don't like and put some of their mates in. EY chief economist Sherelle Murphy has said the lack of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy means the path to low and stable inflation and therefore lower interest rates is slower than it needs to be. Deputy Speaker, we want to see this economy get back on track. We want to see Australians' standards of living restored. We want to see inflation back within the target band. We want to see interest rates getting back to the level where they are sustainable for Australians. We want to see real wages rising, not falling, but the 9% they have for working families under this government. We want to see the productivity that drives prosperity getting back on track. But, Deputy Speaker, the only way to do that is to get back to basics. It's to get back to basics, to get back on track, and that means cutting red tape, securing our energy future, reforming our tax system for simpler, fairer tax and lower taxes, particularly for small business, where we've already announced a substantial expansion of accelerated depreciation, restoring sensible workplace laws that are good for both workers and employers, for both sides, Deputy Speaker, something that those opposite used to believe in, encouraging small business and enterprise, and supporting a strong financial sector, all of which leads to a situation where Australian families see hope restored, their standard of living restored, their aspirations restored, and Australians believing again that Australia is the greatest country in the world to live. Deputy Speaker, that's what we stand for. That's what we will be fighting for all the way through the next election.
The question is that this bill now be read a second time. I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and thanks for waking me up there after the Shadow Treasurer spoke. Because I rise to support the Treasury Laws Amendment Reserve Bank Reforms Bill as brought to the House by the Treasurer, my good friend, my neighbour, the Honourable Member for Rankin. The bill seeks to implement reforms to strengthen the Reserve Bank of Australia and make it more independent and efficient and ready for the rest of the 21st century. And obviously the first question we need to ask the chamber, the mighty backbench team opposite me, is why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? Why would the LNP fight against the Reserve Bank when the Governor said she supports this legislation? Why would they vote against this positive change? Why are they fighting the Reserve Bank? That's the question that we will come back to throughout this debate, Deputy Speaker. And with respect, we had a Shadow Treasurer who spent 24 minutes successfully avoiding the legislation in front of the chamber. It was quite a adroit move, I guess, because the Treasurer has actually worked hard with the Shadow Treasurer over the past 18 months to reflect the Shadow Treasurer's views and to gain bipartisan support. We don't want to go off dancing with the crossbench in the House of Reps or the Senate. This is a serious piece of economic legislation that should be debated by the parties of government. Instead, those opposite seem to be running for the hills, betraying Menzies. He must be spinning in his grave at what has become of the mighty Liberal Party, or the LNP version in Queensland. We needed this to have bipartisan support, which is why the member for Rankin, the Treasurer, worked with the Shadow Treasurer. The Labor government believes that the reforms to the RBA, one of Australia's most important economic institutions, should enjoy opposition endorsement. In fact, on a number of points, Labor has accepted the opposition's preferred approach because we want to drive this important legislation forward. As I said, the Shadow Treasurer had 6 requests that he put to the Treasurer. 6 requests, and how many of those 6 were accommodated? All 6. Sadly, the member for Hume was then rolled in yet another example of the constant negativity we get from the coalition. Look, I saw negativity trotted out every single day under Tony Abbott when he was the opposition leader. I saw that in the 43rd Parliament, where he perfected the art of saying no. The Leader of the Opposition obviously has copied from the Tony Abbott playbook and he's just said no to everything. He doesn't believe in national unity, has no vision for our nation. All he can do is say no. His default response to any reform is to say no. It's his go-to happy position. Look, over history, many countries, many areas have been led by that strongman leader. The strongman leader. You know it, if you look through your history books, you can see them. They're peppered throughout the history books. And the member for Dixon, having studied under Tony Abbott, has said, give me some of that. Give me some of that tactic. But unfortunately, you know, Deputy Speaker, have you ever been to Aldi? I'm not sure about the Aldis in Victoria, but in Queensland, in the middle aisle, they have this sort of treasure trove of amazing things you can find in Aldi. The member for Dixon, the opposition leader, has become the strongman bought in the treasure trove at Aldi. That's where he's picked up his strongman persona. It doesn't quite work. He's a poor man's emulation of Tony Abbott. And contrast this approach, the Dr No approach, with the Albanese Labor government. Because this bill, the one that was not discussed by the Shadow Treasurer at all, he touched on it once in 25 minutes. This bill implements the government's response to an independent review of the Reserve Bank of Australia. I heard the backbenchers opposite talking about independence. Well, this is a review not mentioned by the Shadow Treasurer. So we're backing this reform in to reintroduce the independence of the RBA and to mandate the RBA's overarching objective, as supported by Governor Bullock. as supported by Governor Bullock. I've heard a lot of questions late about people supposedly attacking the RBA. Those speaking need to indicate why they are attacking a piece of legislation that the Reserve Bank Governor supports. The measures included in this bill and the other associated changes represent the biggest reforms for the Reserve Bank in over 3 decades. These measures will ensure that our monetary policy framework is sound and that the RBA can make the right calls that are in the best interests of the Australian people and the Australian economy. So I ask again, Deputy Speaker, to vote against them, as the LNP intends to do, is fighting the Reserve Bank Governor's recommendation. Fighting the Reserve Bank Governor's recommendation. Australia as a nation has enjoyed historically good economic outcomes. Despite what the Shadow Treasurer said, most of those economic reforms were set up under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. They were the visionaries, the economic visionaries, that actually set Australia up for years and years of growth, as acknowledged by John Howard, the longest-serving Liberal Prime Minister. Our ability to stay stable and strong through crises such as the global financial crisis has made Australia a gold star economy and meant that we're a strong market for foreign investment. And one of the key reasons we're able to absorb supply and demand shocks to our economy is the ability of the RBA to adapt and react to changing economic times. The RBA is a strong arm's-length institution in Australia. Maintaining and strengthening its independence is imperative in future-proofing our economy. Giving the RBA a strong set of aims and the tools necessary to achieve them will ensure that the Australian economy continues to be stable long into the future. One of the recommendations from the Reserve Bank review was to ensure the trajectory of the RBA with a long-term objective. So this bill seeks to implement this recommendation with the mandate that the overarching objective of the RBA is to, and I quote for those opposite, promote the economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia now and into the future. How could the LNP vote against this? Why would they want to fight the Reserve Bank? It is a big question that goes to the character of those opposite, I would suggest. Deputy Speaker, as our financial systems evolve and become more complex, our targets must also evolve. This bill confirms that monetary policy should have the dual objectives of price stability and contributing to full employment. You'd have to be an idiot to vote against such a proposition. Without setting out strong targets for the RBA, we cannot have a stable monetary policy, and this outlines the RBA as a robust arm's-length institution while still giving it a strong set of aims. We all agree that the RBA is a vital institution and it's imperative that we continue to ensure its ability to operate in the modern financial system. Part of this approach will be to replace the existing Reserve Bank Board with a new Monetary Policy Board and a Governance Board. The Monetary Policy Board will be responsible for the monetary and financial system stability policies of the RBA, chaired by the Governor. The Governance Board will determine the policy of the RBA that is not within the remit of the Monetary Policy Board or the Payment System Board and will be the accountable authority of the bank. The Payment System Board will continue to set the RBA's payment system policy and will be chaired by the Governor. This approach will aid in delivering stronger monetary policy decision-making and give the RBA the flexibility to make nuanced monetary policy decisions. So I ask again, Deputy Speaker, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? This bill will also clearly delineate the responsibilities of each board and establish a mechanism to facilitate consultation in the event of any overlap. The Governor of the Reserve Bank will be a member of all 3 boards and will be responsible for resolving any disagreements between the boards. The Governor will be the first chair of the Governance Board. This enables continuity during a period of change. External chairs may be appointed after the initial transition period. The governance model will ensure that the Monetary Policy Board and the Payment System Board can achieve their legislative functions independently. All 3 boards will be subject to the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act 2013, except where there are inconsistencies with their statutory functions. And so I ask yet again, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? Existing members of the Reserve Bank Board will transition to the Monetary Policy Board automatically. The exception is if they advise the Treasurer that their preference is to be on the Governance Board. The Labor government is happy to respect the wishes of the current board members, especially as the Monetary Policy Board has a set of different responsibilities and different expectations. These include time commitment, public engagements and the publication of unattributed votes. This proposed amendment has been included to meet the expectation of the opposition, specifically, as discussed and agreed on with the Shadow Treasurer, and that the expectation that all current board members automatically move to the Monetary Policy Board. So I ask again, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? The modern Australian economy requires modern monetary policy. Ensuring that the dual mandate of the RBA is imperative in the future stability of the RBA. Full employment has always been a goal of monetary policy since the inception of the RBA. Price stability and managing inflation are goals that are consistent with how the RBA has interpreted its mandate for many, many years. Formalising these processes give the RBA a stronger mandate to fulfil these responsibilities. In a modern, globalised economy, it's imperative that price stability remains a consistent goal to give us a good grounding in all international trade agreements. So this bill reinforces the RBA's independence through limiting the power of the Treasurer to override the RBA's monetary policy decisions. The Treasurer will only be able to exercise this power in extreme circumstances or when doing so is in the public interest. Asserting the autonomy of the RBA sends a strong signal both to Australians and the international market. This message is that we are committed to long-term, stable economic management. So I ask again, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? Ensuring the RBA's independence allows it to get on with managing monetary policy and allows us to get on with the business of governing. The Albanese government has made strong economic management a priority since we were elected, and allowing the RBA to manage monetary policy while we focus on fiscal policy has ensured that we create sensible long-term economic reform. So this bill will also remove the power of the RBA to determine the lending policies of banks. This is a straightforward procedural change. The institution of APRA is now responsible for directing the lending activity of private banks. Therefore, it does not make sense for the RBA to have this remit. The RBA has not exercised its power to determine lending policies since APRA was established way back in 1998, last century. One of the first acts of the Treasurer when we entered government was to conduct a review of the RBA, and this is because we are dedicated to fact-based, rational economic management. Reviewing our institutions is imperative in ensuring that we continue to meet the needs of a continually evolving economy. This bill is the culmination of this review and implements the government's response to the many recommendations. The review, called an RBA Fit for the Future, indicates that to continue evolving, our institutions need to keep up with the modern world. Just like the RBA, we are dedicated to being fit for the future, and the Albanese government has a clear commitment to a better future for all Australians. And so I ask again, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? Robust institutions paired with robust governments create a strong and stable nation. This bill implements key reforms to the Reserve Bank in order to make sure that our main economic institution is capable of combating the economic challenges of the modern world. The Labor government has consulted extensively, not only with the Shadow Treasurer and other members of the opposition, but with the current and former RBA staff and academics to develop a fact-based, bipartisan approach to our monetary policy. As I've mentioned, when making changes to the Reserve Bank, it is vital that we have a strong consensus on the way forward. So I ask those opposite again, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? Everyone in Parliament House understands the importance of stability when it comes to our national economy. That is why we've taken steps to make sure that these reforms come from a full review and with widespread consultation. And so I ask yet again, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? The Albanese government is strongly committed to sensible and responsible economic reform and management. We do so as a party of government, not a party of protest. This bill is the embodiment of this commitment and demonstrates how mature governments create long-term policy outcomes that benefit all Australians. And so I ask those opposite yet again, why would the LNP fight the Reserve Bank by voting against this positive change? Deputy Speaker, in closing, I go back to this bill, quite a simple bill, a bill that has been consulted with the opposition because they are a party of government. We did not want to go and consult the crossbench and see where some of their more extreme views would go. We wanted to consult with the party of government, and the Shadow Treasurer was on board and then was rolled by the guy that came from the Aldi Treasure aisle. So, in closing, we know that this legislation will create a stronger government, a stronger economy and a stronger Australia. And I commend this to the bill to the House and ask the LNP to go back to the Aldi Treasure aisle and buy themselves a new leader.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Groom.
Speaker, I will miss the member for Moreton. I will miss him deeply. Labor didn't miss him, shot him down in his prime. Shot him down in his prime, sadly, Speaker. He's just about to cut loose too. He knows the personal regard I have for him. But on this, as with many of his speeches, he offers so much work for us to engage in. And I'm going to take him up on 3 points, Speaker, because there's 3 points I think we want to hear as these Labor talking points get repeated through the rest of this speech. Firstly, the bizarre accusation that we're somehow fighting with the RBA. Let's call this out. This is what we call an accusation in a mirror. It's a tactic you use to attribute your motives to your opponent and hope no one will notice. Scoundrels across the world use it in politics to try and get away from the fact that they've been caught out. You've been caught out, you're fighting with the RBA. Every single credible economist is saying this, Speaker. Labor is fighting with the RBA at the moment. There is no one in the world, Speaker, who is going to listen to that speech, no matter how many times the member for Moreton or any other Labor member speaks it afterwards and tries to twist the world around. They've picked a fight with the RBA, Speaker. They've picked a fight with the RBA. The world has seen it, and that is what we're going to call it. The second one I want to point out is when we speak to this piece of legislation, one of the things I'm going to raise are the various attacks that have been made on the RBA. And I want to point out in that speech, it was just, again, laden with attacks. Attacks on the Shadow Treasurer, attacks on the Leader of the Opposition, attacks on the character of those opposite. This is all they've got. This is all they've got. They've been caught out, Speaker. They've been caught out. They're using poor logic in their arguments, and they're using personal attacks. And the third one, and I think it's very relevant to this piece of legislation, Speaker, because to point to the time of Paul Keating as a Treasurer. And credit where it's due. Some of his reforms will be remembered for a long time in this country for the benefit they raised. But when we're talking about the independence of the RBA, I'd like to take you to one of Paul Keating's more famous quotes, talking about his relationship with Bernie Fraser, where he said, "I've got the RBA in my pocket. I have the RBA in my pocket." That was Keating's view on the relationship between the government and the RBA. So if we're going to praise that time, let's remember that's exactly the view that he took in terms of how the government and the RBA's relationship should look like. And I think that's relevant when we look at the objections that this side of the House are raising to this particular piece of legislation. So I thank the member for Moreton for all the fodder he gives us, Speaker. But, Speaker, it was on the 28th of February that I first raised my concerns about the government's intentions around stacking the RBA. And I called it out back then. It was in the Sydney Morning Herald. And I was concerned that the proposed legislation at that stage was going to give Labor the power to stack the board so that they could control decisions on interest rates to effectively reduce the independence of the RBA by stealth, Speaker. That was my concern at the time. And I raised my concerns publicly and I stand by them. To his eternal credit, the Shadow Treasurer argued, no, we must give the government the opportunity to demonstrate that their intentions are pure. That their intentions are pure and that in what is an important piece of work that has been done, review of the RBA, that they will not use this report, they will not use the findings to reduce the independence of the RBA, but they will act with a good conscience, that they will put the people of Australia's needs first, and they will ensure that the independence of the RBA is maintained. And the Shadow Treasurer held that view. And, Speaker,
it's important. I think it speaks to the views of this side of the House. We have treasured the independence of the RBA. In fact, Speaker, I've talked about the relationship between Keating and Fraser. It was under Peter Costello and his relationship with Ian Macfarlane that we established firmly that independence of the RBA, that we gave them clear conduct and clear guidelines to follow. And ever since that time, by setting the target band of inflation that the RBA was to work towards, we have had that independence. And we can see that in commentary from former Prime Minister John Howard, where he talked about during in his time, there were decisions made by the RBA that certainly caused him a lot of grief, but he had to accept that there was an independent decision-making process and that the RBA were the right people to make those decisions. They were the independent body to make those decisions. And whether we like it or not, that's the process. So this side of the House have stood up and we have runs on the board in terms of this. This is important to us. But Speaker, as time has gone on in this debate, there was a worrying trend of attacks on the RBA and specifically on the RBA Governor, Michelle Bullock, coming from Labor, starting directly from the Treasurer himself, claiming that the RBA was smashing the economy, a claim that no credible economist has substantiated. No one else is willing to stand behind that. That is a claim that has absolutely no substance and no one credible believes. And yet our Treasurer made it. And tried to convince Australians that the pain that they're suffering, the economic pain that is going from household to household, is the result of the RBA. And this was followed up. This was followed up from the very top of the Labor Party. Wayne Swan decided to jump in and claim that the RBA was punching itself in the face, backing up, going a little bit further than the Treasurer. And shortly after Mr Swan's comments, the Treasurer tried to disassociate himself from those comments but maintained the RBA were the bad guys in the situation. They were indeed smashing the economy. Now, if that weren't bad enough of a hit job, coming into putting this legislation in front of us that enables the government to sack and stack the RBA board as they choose and see fit, we then had this incredible piece from the ABC. One senior Labor figure described to the ABC on Friday the RBA as barbarians, as weirdos, in the thrall of some bizarre groupthink, and worst of all, Speaker, that Governor Bullock is a nutter. This is coming from a senior Labor figure quoted in the ABC. This is a series of attacks that we have seen coming from the government in the lead up to putting this legislation on the table. Now we have the Treasurer's position has been backed by the Prime Minister, backed by members of the government front bench, backed by Labor-aligned commentators. No one from the government has acknowledged that these statements are indeed attacks that are without precedent, attacks that do nothing to help the Australian people, attacks that do nothing to maintain the independence of the RBA. There is no apology from the government from these baseless attacks. And when Speaker, the government was then challenged. So if you think the RBA should change its attitude, then simply change the target band. Go on, change the target band. If you want to see interest rates reduced, change the target band that would allow the RBA to make a different decision. When they were challenged with that, of course, they ran away. They ran away from that. Oh no, we wouldn't want to actually do anything. These are just attacks. These are just simply attacks we're going to throw out, Speaker. So when we see these sort of attacks come through, it absolutely makes us question the motives of the government in bringing forward this legislation. Why else would you try and drag the RBA through the mud in the way that they have tried to do here, in the lead up to legislation that enables them to sack and stack the board in a way that suits the government of the day? It's incredible, Speaker. It's absolutely incredible. Now, why are we here? Why are we seeing this? Why does the government feel the need to increase its influence and to remove the independence of the RBA board. We're here because things are bad. The economy is in a very, very bad way. Living standards have fallen by 8.7% since this government came to power. 8.7%. That is incredible. That is more than any country, any OECD country. Productivity has collapsed 6.3%. We've seen household savings that built up during the COVID period are now down 10.2 percentage points. And the economy has absolutely stalled, experiencing the slowest GDP growth rate since the 1990s, outside of the pandemic. Things are bad, Speaker. Things are bad. And I think what's important to say, Speaker, when going through this piece of legislation and the intent that is clearly behind it, I think it's important for people who believe in the independence of the RBA to stand up and say, things are bad, but it is not the fault of the RBA. The RBA have a very clear mandate, a very clear target band that they have to bring inflation down to. That is their job. That is their job. Now, this side of the House absolutely stands by any measures that can be made to improve the board, the functioning, the way that the RBA works. We have been committed to that all the way through. And the Shadow Treasurer's patience in working with the Treasurer on this bill all the way through, is a demonstration of our willingness to engage in that process. But we must make this point very clear to Australians. This is not the RBA's fault. We are not here because of the RBA. The challenges you are facing in your economy are not because of the RBA. Do not listen to these attacks. These attacks were done in the prelude to this legislation coming through, and they have a clear purpose, Speaker. And it is not a purpose that aligns with the betterment of Australia. It is not a purpose that will help bring inflation down. It is not a purpose that will make life easier for Australians, Australian households and businesses. It is a political purpose. It is purely a political purpose that will enable the government of the day to influence pressure on the decisions of the RBA. Now, Speaker, I think that is a terrible situation. But you know what, Speaker? We can debate this piece of legislation. The reality is it will go through the House and it will go up to the Senate. And there we will see a prelude of what a minority Labor Greens government might look like. We'll get a little sniff of just what a Labor Greens minority government might look like, because it is there that the Greens will have their way with the RBA. And it's a terrifying thought, because we've already heard that it is the express intention of the Greens to enable the Treasurer to have the power to overturn interest rate decisions. That's what they're putting on the table as a starting point. The second one they've talked about, they want the RBA to tell banks how to lend. This is where the Greens are starting from a level of intervention which is unlike anything we have seen. This is where we're heading. So, in part, Speaker, as sad as I am to see this process of the Shadow Treasurer trying to work with the Treasurer on this, sad to see this come to the resolution it has, I am quite grateful, because we get to see a prelude of what a minority government might look like when the Labor government have to deal with the Greens, when Greens ideology will play out on such important issues as how the RBA board will function, will operate. And I think the Australian people will be grateful of the opportunity to see that too, Speaker. Because there is nothing more terrifying. There is nothing more terrifying than the thought of the Greens being at the helm of the most important independent economic body in Australia. Of the Greens having the control, having the influence to get a Treasurer to overturn the RBA's decision on interest rates. What a terrifying thought. This is exactly what Peter Costello set out way back in 1996 to ensure would never happen again. That never again could we have a Treasurer like Paul Keating say, I've got the RBA in my pocket. On this side of the House, we don't want that. and we have fought to maintain that position. As we stand here today, that is exactly where the government is taking us. That is exactly where the government is taking us, back in time to a place where the Treasurer has the RBA in their pocket, because that is explicitly the desire of the Greens Party. Speaker, we are going back in time, back to a worse place. This will not make life easier for Australians. This will not make life better for Australians. It is short-term opportunism on behalf of the government. They should be ashamed.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Prior to the 2022 election, Labor committed to conducting an independent review of the RBA. The matter before us today is yet another example of the Albanese Labor government's fulfilling its election commitments. This bill, Ms Deputy Speaker, addresses those aspects of the RBA review requiring legislation. It should be noted that not all recommendations of the review are covered by the bill before us. Some are being dealt with administratively, both by the RBA and the government, and partially through the statement on the conduct of monetary policy, while other recommendations are progressed by the Council of Financial Regulators. More than ever before, Australia needs a strong monetary policy and framework. And more than ever, Australia needs a strong, high-performance central bank. The government knows these are challenging times, and we know the struggles that Australians are facing. It is timely that this bill is before us today, because the legislation is central to ensuring that we have the best and strongest monetary policy possible to meet both the challenges of today and those of tomorrow. Firstly, the legislation before us reinforces the independence of the RBA in the operation of monetary policy. The corollary of this is removing the government's power to override monetary decisions. Interestingly, this override has never actually been used, but formalising it is nonetheless important if we're going to have a genuinely independent operation of monetary policy. Secondly, the bill mandates the RBA's overarching objective to promote the economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia now and into the future. This statement of intent is important to ensure the RBA stays on track and to serve the people it is meant to, all Australians. Next, the bill confirms the monetary policy should have dual objectives and price stability and contributing to full employment. The dual mandate is consistent with how the RBA interpreted its mandate for many years. And both of these mandates will ensure inflation and its destructive effects are addressed as well. Fourthly, 2 new boards will be created. One will be focused on monetary policy and the other on the management of the RBA. The Monetary Policy Board will be responsible for the monetary and financial system stability policies. It will be chaired by the Governor. The Governance Board will determine the policy of the RBA, not in the remit of the Monetary Policy Board or the Payment System Board, and will be the accountable authority of the bank. The Payment System Board will continue to set the RBA's payment system policy. This governance model minimises the potential for confusion or conflict by clearly delineating the responsibilities of each board and establishing a mechanism to facilitate consultation in the event of an overlap. Importantly, the Governor is set to be a member of all 3 boards and will therefore be charged with resolving any disagreements between them. Fifthly, this bill clarifies the RBA's responsibility to contribute to the financial system stability. And finally, the bill repeals the RBA's power to direct the lending activity of private or commercial banks, a function that was transferred to the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority back in 1998. The RBA has been in existence since 1960. Since that time as a nation, we've faced any number of challenging economic circumstances, not the least the GFC. The current times present their own unique set of challenges and difficulties. The task for this Parliament, Deputy Speaker, is to ensure that our institutions, not the least our central bank, are up to speed and fit for purpose to meet these challenges. This bill does that. I commend the bill to the House.
Question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Menzies.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues from both sides who have spoken on this bill. It is a sad position that we have arrived here. It seems that in many negotiations for bipartisan support, and that is to be welcomed, they don't always get there. And the glue that is required for it to get there is trust. And that trust was broken in the last week. And it was broken by the conduct and the actions of the Treasurer, backed in by others, including the former Treasurer and his former boss, in their attack of the RBA. That's what changed here. So we've heard indignation upon indignation from those opposite about how dare you not sign up to the agreement that we were negotiating with you? How dare you? Well, the reason it happened is because of the very calculated way in which the Treasurer sought to deflect attention and accountability from himself and the government to the RBA. That's the unprecedented change. That's why we're in this position. That's why. And it is disappointing for that to have happened. And you would have to ask, why has the Treasurer done that? Well, why he has done that is because of the real economic data that is coming in. And it's data that we know to be true when we speak to families in our electorate. They know they have less money in their pocket. They know that prices of everything are going up. They know that their mortgage repayments are at record levels, and they know that they are being pushed through into higher tax brackets through bracket creep. So they know that real incomes are down because their real incomes are down. But let's look at the data. We had the data come in. Living standards in Australia have collapsed. They've collapsed by a figure of 8.7% since this government took office. 8.7%. Now, it's common in various election campaigns for leaders or opposition leaders to say, are you better off than you were 3 years ago, 2 years ago? Are you? And it's a legitimate question, and it can't be one that's asked in a self-serving way when it suits. And the answer to that question, and we're not fully through this term, is no, and by a figure of 8.7%. 8.7%. The average wage in Australia is $95,000. The median wage, which half of all Australians are on, is $65,000. $65,000. So they didn't have 8.7% sitting around in a savings account to deal with this loss in real income. And let's talk about the three categories that are hitting Australians. First of all, there is just the cost of everything. And that key energy commodity, and it's particularly important in the colder states like mine in Victoria, gas, it's up 33%. Now, for anyone who knows a little bit about compound maths, how does that work going forward? It works in this way. I spoke to a dry cleaner in my electorate in Templestowe who's been there for many decades. And he said in the last 6 years, and I acknowledge, Deputy Speaker, that goes over multiple governments, but in the last 6 years, his gas bill for his dry cleaning business is 6 times what it used to be. Now, other than wages, and most of it is he's self-employed, so he is the wage, that is his number one expense, gas, and it's up 6 times in 6 years. But it's rising faster than it ever has before. Electricity is up 14%, even after the rebates. Rents are up 16%. Health is up 11%. Education up 11%. Food up 12%. And insurance up 17%. Now, again, you can't just isolate those increases to this term. They get compounded over time, so that when people reflect upon where they were 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there's many multiples increase on the bills that are going out. So that's one part of the trifecta, the cost of living. And it's more than a slogan. It is about real impact and that heartbeat that gets skipped when people open that envelope and look at the bill. The second part of the trifecta is interest rates and mortgage repayments. And for those who are paying off a mortgage or are trying to rent a house where the landlord is paying off a mortgage, they're getting hit harder than anyone else. And so we've heard, and My good friend, the member for Bennelong, is opposite here. We heard from the big bank CEOs who quite clearly said that not all Australians have been hit equally. They're not. And those who have been hit hardest are aged between 30 and 44, and they live in the southeastern states, including from my state of Victoria and the member for Bennelong state in New South Wales. They've been hit extra hard. And that's not an accident that that's happening under this government's watch. And then the third part of the trifecta that leads to that drop in real disposable income is the fact that income tax is rising as Australians are pushed through higher brackets for income tax. And that's the term bracket creep. So what does the government propose to do in all of this? Well, the one thing they could do that is meaningful is to take pressure off the Reserve Bank by pulling spending back. And they haven't done that. In fact, they've done the opposite. They've put their foot on the gas. They have massively increased spending in this term. And that has caused, more than anything else, the Reserve Bank to have to do the work. The second part is what we hear about all of the time in question time and in talking points and in the media. It's that, don't worry, that 8.7% loss in real disposable income, the government's here to help. The government's here to help. But that help is treating the symptoms and not the cause of this economic crisis. So we are giving families who are facing a $10 increase in a bill a dollar subsidy, 10 to 1. It's not even touching the edges. It's not helping. But then they get to say, we're here to help and you voted against it, coalition. Well, we are a serious party that is here to propose solutions that treat the causes and not the symptoms. And the cause is excessive government spending. And then again, the reply is predictable. Oh, well, coalition, tell us what key programs you're going to cut, including in veterans and in much-needed care economy expenses items. And again, that's a cheap talking point, because at the very time when families are cutting back on their own expenses and they're finding savings, they're finding them, and they don't have many places to look. But we know there's waste and inefficiencies in government. We know that. And there are many places to find them, and you know that this government's not even looking for them because they're having you do all the work or the RBA do all the work on the increases. And so, Deputy Speaker, when we consider these reforms, there were some good parts that I think sensible people can agree on, but at the core of our concerns is a lack of trust with this government to deal with it, because this government is looking for anyone to blame but themselves. Anyone to blame but themselves. And the Treasurer has shown that in question time. There's a reason the Treasurer was asked question through today's question time and yesterday, and there was a lot of complaints that we weren't doing that in the last sitting period, but I don't think the government's too happy that they are getting asked. So the Treasurer was asked to confirm if Australia had been in a household recession for the past 6 quarters, which is the longest running per capita drop on record. It's a pretty simple question with a simple answer. And what did he say? The Treasurer, all he could say was that the government was throwing around multiple billions in subsidies. The very thing that's leading to the increase in interest rates, that's all he could respond with. He was invited to confirm that since the government was elected, Australian families have suffered a bigger real fall in disposable income than any other OECD country. It's not a record you want to break. And again, instead of addressing that real concern, which is a fact, the Treasurer spent his time talking about the coalition, engaging in politics rather than actually solving the problems for Australian families. And this is bigger than the election cycle that we have before us, Deputy Speaker. We have collapsing productivity rates in Australia, collapsing productivity rates. And when we pull open and dust off the intergenerational report from last year, we will see that without an increase in productivity, current projections on government spending will go from $25,000 per person to $40,000 per person in 2063, within a generation. Now, without increases in productivity, and that's adjusted for inflation, then how does that work? How do we get to be the prosperous nation that people move heaven and earth to move to? How do we get to be a nation that rewards hard work, education, and people who take a risk rather than being born into the right family? How does that work when the average wage will still be, with no increases in productivity, $95,000 and a median of $65,000, when $40,000 per person is required for Commonwealth government spending alone? It doesn't work, Deputy Speaker. It doesn't work. And so this isn't just about the immediate cycle. This is structural. This is serious. It's about what sort of nation we want to be and whether we can afford the things that Australians rely upon us to deliver. So, Deputy Speaker, it would have been nice to have worked together on this, but trust was obliterated when the government and the Treasurer sought to avoid responsibility for the very thing they have been elected to deal with. And we talk about going to our electorates and earning their trust. Well, Australians lent their trust to this government at the last election, and it has been abused. It has been abused. And I think Australians are asking themselves, am I better than I was 2.5 years ago? And the answer is a clear no.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and rise to speak on this bill. It's been made very clear that the opposition will not be supporting the government's proposals here to reform the Reserve Bank Act, and we approached this topic with a great deal of good faith, and it is very disappointing that the government has taken us to the point where we can't work with them and support them in reform of the Reserve Bank, because the thing I do agree with the Treasurer about is that these things should be bipartisan. We're talking about how the monetary policy of this country operates, and the trusted organisation, the Reserve Bank, which quite rightly has independence from political interference, how they operate, how they govern themselves and how they make decisions that affect every single Australian. And it is disappointing that the government is now pursuing reform without bipartisanship. This brings back memories of the last time they did this on something that required bipartisanship, the Indigenous voice referendum, and we all know how that ended up. So we'll see what negotiations they do in the Senate with the minor parties, but it's very regrettable that they want to push forward with reform of an institution that should be above partisan politics, the Reserve Bank, without bipartisan support. What's just as regrettable is the behaviour of members of the broad Labor family, on the record and off the record, in the last few weeks, deciding to now start to turn the RBA and their decision-making into some kind of political attack point. Deciding, I suppose, that they're feeling so much heat from the electorate in this cost of living crisis that maybe they can make it all someone else's fault. And some comments have been veiled, some have been more direct, some people have been cowardly and not put their name to their commentary in off-the-record briefings to journalists. The Treasurer's been very wishy-washy in what he's had to say, and the confidence that he has and hasn't at different times expressed in the way in which the RBA operates. Former Treasurer Swan was outrageous and appalling in just the last week in the way in which he launched his own attack on the Reserve Bank and the decisions that they're making. The Reserve Bank are doing what they need to do, which is make decisions with the policy lever they've got, monetary policy, the cost of capital in our economy, and if they were working in concert with those that have the fiscal policy lever, being the federal government, then they might not have had to make some of the decisions that they have in the last few years since Labor were elected. And I, like everyone, wish interest rates were lower, not like the government because they're worried about their own political fortune, but because I genuinely care about the people that are struggling to meet the cost of their mortgages and other debts that they might have because interest rates have so dramatically increased since Labor came to power. But of course, monetary policy interacts with fiscal policy. Monetary policy can loosen and encourage and stimulate the economy, or it can contract to dampen the economy. And the Reserve Bank has to make decisions based on their forecasts and various other sources of information that they have access to make judgments on how the economy is travelling, and in particular their primary goal, which is to make sure that inflation is kept between a target band of 2 and 3%. That hasn't been the case for the last couple of years, and the Reserve Bank has increased the overnight cash rate, which obviously results in a cascade of rate adjustments across the various loans in our economy. The Reserve Bank is the most reliable lender in Australian currency. They print the Australian currency. They're the most reliable person to lend money to, so whatever their rate is, every other rate will be set against that. And the most significant one for any Australian is their mortgage rate. Mortgage rates are running high because the Reserve Bank has had to increase interest rates to try and tame inflation. Now, fiscal policy can play a big role in inflation because government spending is an enormous part of economic activity. And when it expands, it fuels inflation, and when it contracts, it puts downward pressure on it. We've got a situation where the Reserve Bank, who are doing all the heavy lifting when it comes to addressing the overheating economy and high inflation, are now being attacked by a government that is not doing what they could with their own policy levers, and so instead are deciding to start setting up the RBA as a kind of straw man in the economic argument as they head towards an attempt to get themselves re-elected. Politicising the RBA should be a no-go in our modern democracy. It wasn't always the case, and certainly in decades gone by, there was a lot of politicisation of decisions of the Reserve Bank. And obviously, when governments are thinking about electoral cycles and deciding what may or may not have a short-term benefit or hit to their political fortunes, that can cloud their judgment in making decisions in the best interest of the long-term price stability of our economy. So clearly, having an independence of politicians and election cycles and allowing a structure that we have right now where the Reserve Bank operates independently and make decisions in that medium to long-term interest of price stability in our economy, not taking into account the political impact for any one particular side of politics, particularly the government of the day, is something that we should absolutely cling to. And what we've seen in the last few weeks, and what we now are highly suspicious of, which leads to us not able to support these proposals, is the repoliticisation of the Reserve Bank, and political leaders cowardly starting to blame the Reserve Bank and criticise and attack the Reserve Bank through the media. I'd love the Reserve Bank to reduce interest rates, but I want them to do it because that's the sensible monetary policy decision to make. And that means that they have a confidence that by reducing rates, that is going to maintain the target of inflation in our economy in that 2 to 3% band, where we are not yet at. And if the government of the day, this Labor government, wanted to see interest rates reduced, they should think about what they could do to help the Reserve Bank have a confidence that price stability in our economy, the inflation rate in our economy, is running in that target band. Now, in the decades gone by, when governments interfered in these things and either blatantly, directly made monetary policy decisions or had these sort of shadowy processes that really meant that the Treasurer or Finance Minister of the day was exerting influence on monetary policy decisions, we had rampant inflation. And that was the case across different sides of politics, I might add, and it's clearly the case around the world where they don't have independent monetary policy setting of their central banks. The worst way to destroy wealth, to crush wealth, is for inflation to erode it away, because it gets absolutely everyone. It gets asset holders, it gets consumption, it gets real wages. No one in the economy is rewarded in a high inflationary environment. And what's even worse, or equally as bad as high inflation, is a high price volatility, where policy settings are changing dramatically, and you see overseas countries that are, devalue their currency or make dramatic steps in their cost of capital by the way in which they set their cash rate at the central bank level, and businesses and investment just completely evaporates away from those economies. And we're very lucky that we've had decades and decades in this country, where there has been a very high confidence that our independent Central Reserve Bank and our floating exchange rate mean that there is a great deal of certainty for markets and certainty for investors in our economy that knee-jerk policy decisions won't be made that could leave capital stranded or capital dramatically devalued in our economy. And our economy, and particularly our jobs market and people's standard of living in this country, is very much contingent on strong investment that drives an expansion of the economy, economic growth, and the most important thing in our social compact, sharing the dividend of economic growth between those that invest their capital and the workforce of the economy, making sure that real wages are growing. Wages can grow on paper, nominally, and if inflation is running hotter than that, as it has for the last couple of years, then workers are going backwards. A lack of price stability and high inflation through the politicisation of the central bank decision-making process, the biggest destruction of wealth will come to real incomes. We know that from the history of any study of high inflationary environments. So we regret that we're not having a debate around genuine bipartisan support for reform to the Reserve Bank Act, and that's very disappointing, because it's the sort of thing that should have bipartisan support. When the Hawke-Keating government were undertaking the reforms that they undertook, that included central bank reform, most importantly things like floating the Australian dollar, having a market mechanism for the determination of the Australian dollar, politically difficult terrain to traverse. That was done with the support of the then opposition. And whilst what's in this bill is not in the league of those dramatic reforms, it's in the category of them. And it's really disappointing that the government's attitude is they don't want to work with us in reform that everyone can support to something as significant in our economy as the governance of the Reserve Bank. So with those comments, I urge the House not to support the second reading of this bill.
Question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Millions of renters, mortgage holders, young people and families across the country are really suffering, struggling to make ends meet in the wake of relentless Reserve Bank rate hikes. Since the Labor government came to power in 2022, rents have gone up by 31%, and the average mortgage payment has increased by a staggering $1,667 a month. Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock has actually publicly conceded that rate hikes are pushing people to the edge, while she blithely continues to hike rates. To rub more salt in the wound, Bullock also said that people are now facing the brutal reality of having to sell their homes to survive. And who suffers most from this hiking of interest rates? Those least responsible for inflation. And yet, Bullock has offered no relief, no hope to the millions of Australians doing it tough, stating that she doesn't expect the RBA to cut rates in the near term. According to the Treasurer's own words, the Reserve Bank has smashed the economy. So why is he then seeking to remove the democratic oversight over the RBA? Another capitulation by Labor to the power of capital, the big banks and the corporations. They are clearly who have the ear of this government, not you, everyday Australians. Labor's so-called reforms to the Reserve Bank of Australia are a lost opportunity for genuine change. The RBA is described as independent, but we know that the decisions that they make are political. These are decisions that affect every Australian. When the RBA makes a decision, someone loses. Right now, that is the 40% of renters who are struggling to pay rent, the 1.6 million households in mortgage stress because of interest rate hikes, the 85,000 Australian households who could be at risk of actually losing their homes. And the government wants to give Bullock and the RBA even more power? They want to remove Section 11 of the RBA Act, which gives the Treasurer the ability to overturn the RBA's decisions, leaving Australians at the mercy of unelected bureaucrats with zero accountability. Appalling and dangerous. Here's what Section 11 of the RBA Act actually does. It gives the Treasurer the power to intervene to override the Reserve Bank when necessary. The Treasurer could use that power right now to actually reduce interest rates. It's truly baffling. The government tells Australians it's working on cost of living relief, but it has a massive lever it could pull to offer relief to thousands of Australians right now, this very minute, and not only is it not using it, it's trying to remove that power from this and future Treasurers. No wonder ordinary Australians are feeling abandoned or even targeted by this government. Don't let them treat you like idiots, Australians. It doesn't take a genius to realise that the Treasurer wants to rid himself of the power to overrule an RBA decision because he doesn't want to be blamed for massive increases in mortgage payments and rents. These are huge cost of living pressures right now for most Australians. Rather than backing everyday Australians, the Treasurer is once again choosing to wash his hands and let the banks and the corporations continue making massive profits off people's pain. And the banks aren't here for you, that's clear. Recently, we heard from Matt Coman, CEO of the Commonwealth Bank, boasting about their half-yearly profit of $5 billion. That's not even a full year, and they've made $5 billion in profit. Then he calls the Greens' proposal to tax such excessive profits insidious populism. That's in Matt Coman's words. So, of course, he likes the system just the way it is. Labor and the LNP are colluding when it comes to protecting the interests of the banks. Over the last decades, the big banks have donated $5 million to Labor and $6 million to the LNP. And what do the banks get in return for this generosity? They get enormous profits. Profits off the backs of hard-working Australians who are drowning in debt. There's no clearer example of how power really works in this country. If you're facing the prospect of having to sell your home, thanks for the suggestion, Governor Bullock, or you don't think you'll be able to pay your rent at the end of the fortnight, I just want you to know that the Labor government has the power to bring down interest rates right now, and they're choosing not to. The Labor government should retain and use its existing power to overrule the RBA and bring down interest rates. This bill, in its current form, again illustrates Labor's failure to stand up to the banks and the corporation, indeed its comprehensive capture by them. Instead of letting the RBA turbocharge the cost of living crisis, Labor should be stopping inflation and corporate profiteering by supporting the Greens' super profit tax to tax corporations that are price gouging and driving up the cost of essentials, by freezing rents, by putting dental cover into Medicare, and by making childcare free. These initiatives proposed by the Greens are what would actually bring down inflation, what would actually help people, rather than what the RBA, with the government's tacit support, is doing, pushing renters, young people and mortgage holders who aren't causing inflation to the brink. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Cook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. That's one of the most dangerous economic ideas I've heard in my time in this place, having Labor overruling the RBA on interest rates. RBA has been one of the most effective independent institutions that the Australian government has, and to suggest that a political party should be overruling an independent body that's managing our economy and managing inflation is absolutely It's economic vandalism and risk plunging this country into a further, deeper economic crisis than it already finds itself in. That is absolutely ludicrous from the last member, and we need to defend the Reserve Bank that safeguards our prosperity and defend it from politicisation. Suggesting that a party should be setting interest rates running into an election is absolute lunacy. The Reserve Bank, sadly in inflationary periods, we're reminded of the importance of this, and that is populism. That is absolute populism to say we should be allowing political parties to set interest rates. Since the first formal agreement on the framework for monetary policy in '96, which was the formal endorsement of the RBA utilising monetary policy to achieve an inflation rate of 2 to 3%, we've seen its impact. Before this, in 1976 to 84, inflation grew 9.3% annually. Between 1985 and 1992, it grew 6.3% annually. Following the implementation of this target and empowering an independent Reserve Bank, between 1993 and 2023, inflation grew just by 2.6% annually. And why is this important? Well, to quote Ronald Reagan, the very word inflation leads us to think of it as just high prices. Then, of course, we resent the person who puts on the price tags, forgetting that he or she is a victim of this inflation. Inflation is not just high prices, it's a reduction in the value of money. What does that mean? It means individual households get poorer, and if you had populist policy like was just suggested here, what we would see is Australians right across the country get poorer, and it's just a great example that you cannot listen to the Greens. If you allowed the Greens anywhere near the economy, if you allowed them to share the balance of power with Labor, which is a risk in the upcoming election, this is the type of economic vandalism that we will see. If you had that, we risk actually seeing inflation getting back to where it was, Deputy Speaker, 9.3% annually before the Reserve Bank was made independent. Suggesting that the RBA should be overruled by a political party leading into an election on interest rates is absolutely sheer lunacy. Now, thanks to this Labor government, we still have too much money, and I'm glad the Leader of the Greens is here, because if we let a political party start overruling the RBA on interest rates on the lead up to an election, it's really letting, the kid into the candy store. It's absolute lunacy, and I'm sure the Treasurer here would absolutely agree with this. He would absolutely agree that you cannot let, as the Greens just suggested, let a political party overrule an independent group of economists who have done an amazing job. And I'll repeat it. Pardon? So the Leader of the Greens, listen, well, look, we're sick of you politicising. We know you play footsies with the Greens when it suits you. You play footsies when the Greens when it suits you. Now when they're talking about extreme measures like...
Yes. I think the member for Cook needs to be reminded to direct his remarks through the chair.
If you could assist the chair, I was distracted. What was said just then?
It keeps referring to the Treasurer as you.
As a?
As you.
As what?
As you, as in...
Oh, as you. Oh.
Putting his remarks through, through you, the chair.
It would assist the House if you could withdraw.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
And I'd remind you that we refer to members by their electorate name,
yes,
or by their title, for example, Treasurer.
Yeah, sorry, I think there might have been one you in there. I was trying to refer to Mr. Treasurer. But look, and the Reserve Bank's been extremely successful in managing inflation. As I said, between 1976 and 84, inflation was growing by 9.3% annually. 85 to 92, 6.3% annually. And following the implementation of this target, between 1993 and 2023, it increased by just 2.6%. This was the first soft-edged target adopted by a Reserve Bank in the world, and nearly all advanced economies now use the same framework. When reflecting on this agreement, Prime Minister John Howard said it gave confidence that interest rates would be set, reflective of the economic conditions rather than the immediate political considerations. The RBA implemented a rate rise in 2007 held almost on the eve of a federal election, confirming the independence of this body. The Reserve Bank has saved Australian consumers and businesses billions and billions over the years in price increases driven by inflation and has saved their money from being devalued. Now, it's regrettable that the Labor and the Treasurer have chosen to throw bipartisan convention when reforming this important institution and have instead chosen cheap populism with the Greens political party. Australia needs a strong Reserve Bank now more than ever to combat inflation, when we have inflation higher than most developed countries around the world. Interest rates are the major policy lever to combat this cost of living crisis we are now struggling with. This policy lever is crucial for the government, given core inflation remains stubbornly high, higher than almost all other advanced economies in the world at 3.8%. Our core inflation is higher than the US. It's higher than the UK. It's higher than New Zealand. It's higher than Canada. It's higher than Japan, and it's higher than many other countries. And the Reserve Bank has provided clear advice, crystal clear advice, that inflation remains too high. The Governor is on record as saying, and I quote, "Make no mistake, inflation is too high, and the board does remain concerned about the degree of excess demand in the economy." The bank went on to call out Labor's inflationary spending, and I quote, "The stronger outlook for public demand reflects the ongoing spending and recent announcements by federal and state and territory governments." That was the response. That was the response, saying the government's got their foot on the accelerator while the Reserve Bank is jamming on the brakes, and the Australian economy is left to suffer in response. Now, what was the response to this, the bank's frank and fearless independent advice? Well, Dr. Chalmers, who's just left, said interest rates were smashing the economy, ignoring his own role in creating inflation. And his former boss, mentor and president of the Federal Labor Party, Wayne Swan, was quick to add, "The RBA is punching itself in the face." And then Jacob Griever, a journalist, said a senior Labor figure, wasn't named, claimed, and I quote, "The Governor is a nutter," called the Reserve Bank barbarians and called them weirdos. What an attack on an independent institution as this legislation, where they can stack the board, is coming before the House. The timing could not be more politically motivated or better. It's an absolute ridiculous attack on what is one of our best institutions. Now, we've seen two former RBA board members come out and decry these comments made by the Treasurer and his mentor, Wayne Swan. The former RBA board member, Warwick McGibbon, said, and I quote, "You want to think that the government and the central bank are working together in the same direction for the benefit of the country. To make those sorts of comments suggested that maybe there's some other agendas at work, and that is not helpful." There sure are other agendas at work. And another former RBA member, Graham Crahy, said, "For the Treasurer then to be saying, well, this is the Reserve Bank's fault, I don't think there's another serious economist in the country that would agree with that." They're fighting with the Reserve Bank currently. They're fighting with their past board members. The Treasurer has tied one arm behind the RBA's back in trying to fight inflation with his loose fiscal policy, and it shocked this tight monetary policy, and it means we have higher rates for longer. And sadly, the people who will be hurt the most from that are everyday Australians, everyday families doing it tough. This loose fiscal policy, which has included an extra $315 billion in additional spending since 2022, that's $30,000 per household. And those opposite love to say, oh, the coalition's going to be cutting $315 billion and hurting families. Well, I'll tell you what, people in my electorate of Cook do not feel $30,000 better off. When I ask them how do they feel after the last 2.5 years under a Labor government, they tell me they feel much worse off. Make no mistake, the government has created this inflation crisis. The federal government is at an equal record of 11.8% of GDP in the last quarter. The only other time federal government has been at this level was during COVID. Never, ever before. So while we've got high rates, while we're trying to take some of the demand out of that economy, they are stuffing the economy full of money, keeping interest rates higher and devaluing hard-working Australians' bank accounts and money at home. As a result, what does that mean? What have we seen? Well, productivity's created 6.3%. Household savings, they're not only being devalued by inflation, they've dropped 10 percentage points. And we have the slowest GDP for 30 years, over 30 years, since the early 1990s. We've been in a household recession for 18 months. What does that mean? Per capita GDP is going down. That means each household is getting poorer. They are getting poorer and living standards are dropping. These are the implications on everyday Australians for this policy. And the Treasurer is intent on assigning blame for these higher interest rates on everyone else except himself. Well, look, food is now up 12%. Energy's up 14%, even after these rebates they crow about. The hubris to crow about a rebate when the average Australian is paying 14% more in energy prices. But yet, day after day, I have to listen in question time, them slap themselves on the back about rebates. A one-off rebate that is now gone, and Australians are left with 14% higher energy prices in a year. It's well over 20% in the last 2 years. Deferred healthcare. In 2023, a report reported by the Productivity Commission revealed more people postponed or skipped GP visits in the past 12 months because of cost. Another report revealed almost 50% of people forewent heating their home. Labor's big spending agenda is keeping this inflation higher. So what is the mechanical issues with this legislation? Well, it's surely the role of this parliament to safeguard and promote the strength of a Reserve Bank, one of the most critical institutions in this nation. Strong institutions like this bank, like this parliament, like the public service are vital to a strong economy, vital to a strong democracy, and were the model that the rest of the world followed only 30 years ago, but we are weakening them right now. Any actions that undermine the strength of our institutions needs to be called out and halted. Given the comments made by the Treasurer, made by the former Labor Treasurer, the current President, and an unnamed coward calling the Governor of the Reserve Bank a nutter, timed precisely just before this legislation. The fundamental fault of this legislation is that it doesn't transition existing board members into the Monetary Policy Board. Further, and less importantly, the Section 11 test of extreme circumstances has not been defined in the legislation before Parliament. It's leaving a backdoor for political decisions on what should not be political. Managing our economy is too important, and we care about it on this side of the House, and we're not about to let the government wreck it. The opportunity for the Labor to stack the board, who have already jumped at this opportunity by appointing 2 former union officials to the board earlier in their term. What are the risks of the Labor Party compromising with the Greens political party to deliver this reform? And what's the response of the Treasurer to the issues identified by my colleague, the Shadow Treasurer? Instead of bipartisanship with the coalition, the Treasurer now repeatedly wishes to make a deal with the Greens. They don't value the independence of the Reserve Bank. We just called on them to overrule the Reserve Bank on interest rate rises, to overrule them now in an election period. That's what we just heard. We heard that in this chamber. Extremely dangerous. Greens' policy, their policy thought bubble on this significant issue was to try and retain Section 11 of the RBA Act and grant the Treasurer a veto over decisions made by the Reserve Bank. Well, if you think inflation's bad now, if you think your money is worth less than before, if you think you're worse off than you were 2.5 years ago, well, wait until they get the Treasurer to work on this provision. It's going to get worse. So we're standing up for the independence of the Reserve Bank, and we're standing up for everyday Australians.
And I thank the member for Cook for his contribution. The question before the Federation Chamber is that this bill be now read a second time, and I'll give the call to the member for Riverina.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I acknowledge the presence of the Greens leader, the member for Melbourne in the room. Recognise that he's a decent person, although philosophically we are poles apart, absolutely poles apart, and I do worry if the member for Melbourne and the Greens get
any control, any say on the Treasury benches after the next election. And what we're seeing with this legislation tonight, the Treasury Laws Amendment, Reserve Bank Reforms Bill 2023, is the rub. And the rub is that the Greens are already having a large say on policy and, worryingly, disturbingly, economic policy. Because if you read the article by the Sydney Morning Herald's economics analyst Shane Wright, who's a very good journalist, it's because I trained him. I'll take some credit for that. I'm sure Shane won't mind. But this article headed Chalmers Eyes Greens Lifeline for Reserve Bank Overhaul, in which he writes that the Treasurer may drive through the biggest overhaul of the Reserve Bank in a generation with support from the Greens after the coalition walked away from the months of negotiations and concessions aimed at winning bipartisan approval for the changes. Well, yes, we did. And the member for Hume took this position for good reason. And we've seen the to and fro between Labor and the independent Reserve Bank in recent days and times, and it's worrying. But let me go just back a little bit. I want to acknowledge also the work that Dr Philip Lowe did as the 8th RBA Governor. He was Deputy Governor under Glenn Stevens from February 2012 until he became the Governor in his own right in September 2016, and he held that august role until September 2023. And he was castigated, derided by regional newspapers for some of the comments he made about inflation. And it was difficult at the time to predict what might have happened, particularly coming out of the back of the worst of COVID-19. And Dr Lowe did a very, very good job. And Dr Lowe and I went to school together at St Michael's Regional High School. He also attended Trinity Senior High in Wagga Wagga. And it's not just that I stick up for the likes of Shane Wright and Dr Lowe, but they both have been in Wagga Wagga and they understand regionality. They understand what ordinary, everyday people expect from those in positions of power. And both of them occupied positions of power. Shane is a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald and Dr Lowe in his position with the RBA. And I thought Dr Lowe was unfairly treated by some sections of the media during the latter time he was the RBA Governor. And I just want to put on the record my thanks to him for his role and what he did, and for appreciating and understanding the very great pressures on regional Australians and what he did during COVID, because I think it's important to place those sorts of things on the record. And at the moment we are in an inflation crisis. At the moment we are in a crisis of confidence and a cost of living crisis. And much of it, some might even argue all of it, has been brought about by Dr Chalmers and by Labor policies. Well, he does have a...
Ask the member for Riverina to address the Treasurer by his title.
Sure, by the Treasurer. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I called him Dr Chalmers, because he has got a doctorate. He has got a doctorate in economics, but I take your advice. Now, initially the Coalition supported the intent of what was laid out when Labor approached us in relation to the RBA, but in recent months there are fears that the Treasurer would sack and stack the new committee, and it has demanded that all members of the current board be moved to the new committee. Now, and I'm reading here from the Sydney Morning Herald article, Chalmers has agreed to this, but also said he would not move a board member if they preferred to shift to the governance board. And I know that the member for Hume, the Shadow Treasurer, has said that the Treasurer, who last week said high interest rates had smashed the economy, the member for Hume said that the RBA had been undermined by the Treasurer, whilst trying to deflect attention from the government's role in the country's inflation. And of course, the Shadow Treasurer is right in that regard. We previously considered this bill very carefully, but it was agreed that the Coalition would continue to engage in good faith with the government, but unfortunately the government is now not acting in good faith with either us, as the Coalition, as the opposition, or indeed with the RBA. I mean, you cannot have senior members of government, and journalists don't generally make these things up, describing members of the RBA as nutters or weirdos or barbarians. I mean, that is unacceptable, completely unacceptable. In August, the Treasurer wrote to the Shadow Treasurer with some proposed amendments. The government's amendments leave open the option for a complete stitch-up of the RBA board. And following this and what I would say are extraordinary interventions of the Treasurer and his surrogates in just the past week, the Coalition will not be supporting this bill. And indeed, this particular legislation implements what the government said it was going to do with the 2023 RBA review, but it goes too far, because what will happen is that we'll be seeing more and more intervention by the government into the independence of the RBA. Now, we do have a situation where the government has overseen huge increases in inflation. And then we have these incendiary comments by the Treasurer about how the RBA is smashing the economy. And then crab walking back from that in question time, where he repeatedly talks about $1 trillion of Liberal Party debt. Now, first of all, it's nowhere near $1 trillion. I see the member for Griffith agreeing with me. It's not often the member for Griffith and I agree, but it's not $1 trillion. It's not more than $1 trillion either, member for Griffith. It's nowhere near that. And also, it's not just the Liberal Party that actually did the job during COVID. It was the Liberal and the National parties together. And what we got for the debt that the nation found itself in was we saved tens of thousands of Australian lives at a time when the Chief Medical Officer of this nation, Dr. Brendan Murphy, had said that we would lose, if something wasn't done, tens of thousands of Australian lives within weeks, if not months, and we acted and we did everything we could under bizarre, unique circumstances. I mean, the world had not seen a pandemic like this since the end of the First World War. Now, the First World War ended in 1918, and the pandemic of 1919, 1920 took the lives of many, many people, and COVID-19 threatened to wipe out so many people off the face of this earth, and indeed it did, in fact, kill millions. They were piling up coffins in churches because the morgues were filled in Italy. They were burying people in mass graves on Manhattan Island in the United States of America, and they are two countries with good health systems. And we were faced with the prospect of what do we do as a nation? Well, we shut the borders, we put in place a national cabinet. It worked well at the start. We put in place logistics, we put in place methods to get vaccines across the nation and throughout the Pacific. And not only did we save tens of thousands of Australian lives, but we also saved millions of jobs through JobKeeper. And then we get the Treasurer of Australia standing up and saying, well, what did we get for the $1 trillion worth of Liberal Party debt? Well, he should stop saying that, because it's just not true. And what we did get was we got the second best rating in all of the world from the Johns Hopkins Centre, that institute which measured pandemic preparedness and pandemic reaction. And we should be very proud of what we did, because there are people today alive who would not have been so but for the actions that we took. But Labor is growing more and more desperate. A tax on the RBA as unnecessary as they are unwarranted. And of course, we see that when the Treasurer blames the RBA for, quote, smashing, unquote, the economy, we see a very desperate Treasurer, almost akin to the naughty schoolboy who didn't do his homework, who comes to class, teacher asks, where's the homework? And he says, well, the dog ate the homework. And the dog in this instance being the supposed RBA for just doing its job. Now, Michelle Bullock is doing her job. She's doing the job that she was asked to do. She was put in place by this government to do. And what we're seeing is rampant inflation. What we're seeing is an economy that is not supporting business. Each and every day I go into my country communities in the Riverina and Central West, and I see more shops putting up closed or closing down signs in their windows, and we see more and more people sleeping in their cars and tents appearing in places where people just can't simply afford either rent or accommodation or their own home, and what we're getting is a Treasurer blaming the Reserve Bank Governor and the Reserve Bank Board, and then wanting to change the rules so that they can sack said board and that they can do a complete job on the Reserve Bank Board. And this is just unheard of, unparalleled. And then what we find is the government wants to do a deal with the Greens. And here they are, the economic strategists of the nation. And that did you say harsh? Put us in charge, my goodness. Hopefully not, Member for Griffith. Hopefully not. It is a worry. It is a worry. And let me tell you, if the Greens have any say on the Treasury benches, then this nation is headed for far worse inflation figures than we have now, and far worse cost of living pressures. So the Coalition will not be supporting this bill. Labor's growing desperation is becoming more and more evident as time goes on. And I know we've got my EFO coming up, the Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook. I know we have potentially another budget prior to the next election, but who would know? Only the Prime Minister knows when he's going to go out to Yarralumla and hand in his commission. But when he does do that, let's just hope that at the next election that we don't see a minority government in conjunction with the Greens, because at the moment we've got gas up 33%, electricity up 14% even after the taxpayer-funded rebates of $300. I thought it was going to be $275 prior to the last election, but of course, even though that was promised on almost 100 occasions, of course, nothing was further from the truth. Rents are up 16%. I know the member for Griffiths had a lot to say about that and his solution to it, but I don't think he needs to be listened to either, because the Greens have done more to hold up local government development applications than anything, and that is causing a huge problem in local councils and states who are most responsible, let's face it, at the end of the day, for housing and the like. Health up 11%, education up 11%, food up 12%. All these costs add on and on and on to people's household mortgages, household bills. Financial and insurance up 17%. I can hear the Greens yelling out, but rest assured, if they get hold of the Treasury benches, we are all in trouble. But not just we here on Capitol Hill. Ordinary, everyday mums and dads throughout Australia, families, businesses struggling to pay bills now. This bill is not good. This bill will not be supported by the Coalition. We should have an independent RBA. This doesn't give us that.
And I thank the member for Riverina for his contribution. The question is that this bill be now read a second time.
Going to me?
No.
Yeah.
The member for Griffith is next on the speaking list. If you're happy to yield to the member for Ford.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Riverina for his contribution, and he's outlined very well why we won't support this. But I'm pleased that we've come to the position that we have in relation to not supporting this bill, because I didn't support it from the outset. And I didn't support it from the outset because what is being attempted to be done in this bill, or what is proposed to be done in this bill, whereby a government and all of us as elected members of this parliament hand over absolute power to an unelected body, I think is a danger to our democracy. And what I find interesting, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that this isn't the only piece of legislation that has been through this House that allows for this to occur, where ministers take a hands-off approach and go, oh no, it's up to the bureaucrats and up to the public service or whatever other body we have set up. I think that is a very grave danger to the foundation and stability of our democracy. Now, it's interesting, there's been much debate and discussion over the years, and as the Deputy Speaker would know, and also as the member for Melbourne would know, having been joined me in this place in 2010, we've had many debates about the conduct of our banks, etc., over the years that finished up in a Royal Commission. But what a lot of people don't probably realise, Mr Deputy Speaker, there's actually a Royal Commission well before that. Well before that. Back in 1935, there was a Royal Commission that was appointed to inquire into the monetary and banking systems at then present in operation in Australia. And the reason it was appointed was there was a concern that the banks weren't doing their job and actually making the Great Depression worse. Now, what's interesting is to go and read some of the comments in that Royal Commission report, and I want to thank a good friend of mine, Professor Bill Mitchell, for the work he's done on some of this, and I'll quote his work because he's pulled these paragraphs out of the Royal Commission report that I didn't have to go back reading through it again. But in paragraph 143 of that report, it says, "It is essential for the central bank that its relations with the government responsible for monetary policy should be close and cordial in order that there should be a consistency between the government's financial operations and those of the bank." Well, what have we seen in the past week or so, Deputy Speaker? The complete opposite of that. The complete opposite of that. We've seen the Treasurer say that the Reserve Bank is smashing our economy. We've seen a former Treasurer saying that they've been hitting themselves in the face. Well, that to me doesn't speak of a language of ensuring that there are close and cordial relationships between the government and the Reserve Bank to ensure that there is a consistency between the government's financial operations and those of the bank. Far from it. Far from it. And we've seen the comments by the Reserve Bank Governor about her concerns about spending at a government level, both federally and across the states as well. So why would we go down the track then that is proposed in this bill of separating out the accountability of the Reserve Bank through the government and under Section 11, which I fully believe should be retained and never done away with, because those drafters of that legislation back in 1958 or 1957, when it was enacted finally in 1959, but they understood They understood the necessity for the elected representatives in this parliament to maintain, watch and power over our non-elected bodies. And to go back to that 1935 report, it goes on further to say, in our view, the proper relations between the two authorities are these. The federal parliament is ultimately responsible for monetary policy and the governor of the day is the executive parliament. The Reserve Bank has certain, well, it was the Commonwealth Bank at that time, but the Reserve Bank in modern parlance, has certain powers delegated to it by statute. And the board's duty to the community is to exercise those powers to the best of its ability. And where there is a conflict between the government's view of what is best in the national interest and the board's view, the government should give the bank an assurance that it will accept full responsibility for the proposed policy and is in a position to take and will take any necessary action to implement it. It is then the duty of the bank to accept this assurance and carry out the policy of government. Well, that's been done through a statement of principles that the Treasurer has signed and provided to the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank's remit is twofold. It's to deal with inflation, and it's to ensure full employment. So the Reserve Bank is doing their job. But for then the Treasurer to turn around and say, well, I don't like what the Reserve Bank is doing, well, have that discussion, but have it in a cordial way. I mean, I'm sure the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank Governor speak all the time, right? But to go out publicly and demonise the Reserve Bank and the Governor and the rest of her team for doing the job that is actually mandated for them to do, which is to tackle the inflation challenge, as well as full employment, is an attempt, in my view, by the Treasurer to offload the responsibility for his part of the equation. And it's about time the Treasurer accepted responsibility for what they failed to do to deal with the inflationary pressures. Hence, I fully support the position that we have now taken as a coalition to oppose this bill, because I believe that the structure of the Reserve Bank, along with the retention of Section 11, whilst I accept it's never been used, I believe fundamentally for the protection of our democracy that provision should be retained, because we never can say categorically in the future that we don't know that at some point that may need to be used. Heaven forbid. I hope it never has to be used. I hope that the cordial working relationship between the government of the day and the Reserve Bank is maintained, strengthened for the benefit of our country as a whole. And I think the words from the 1935 Royal Commission report remain as valid and as prescient today as they did then. And I oppose the bill, and I'm pleased that as a coalition we've taken the position that we have.
And I thank the member for Ford for his contribution. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. And now I give the call to the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. There are millions of mortgage holders and renters right now across this country getting smashed by an economic system that they are not responsible for, and yet they are asked to pick up the pieces in skipping groceries, in choosing between feeding their kids and paying the rent. And when it comes down to it, since 2022, rents have gone up a staggering 31%. Mortgage repayments, on average, monthly, have gone up by $1,600. And what's happening is that a coalition of the Labor and Liberal Party have decided that they're okay with the Reserve Bank putting up interest rates and forcing ordinary people to pay for an inflation crisis that they had nothing to do with. Because here is the reality. Here is the reality. The Labor government right now could override the Reserve Bank. They have that power in legislation right now and force the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates. And they choose not to. And by doing that, they have decided to enshrine and protect an economic system that always punishes ordinary and everyday people for an inflation crisis they are not responsible for. Let's be clear about what's driving inflation right now and costs going up. It is corporate price gouging. The IMF has pointed out that it is corporate price gouging that is one of the principal drivers of inflation right now. It is Coles and Woolworths using their duopoly power to drive up grocery bills. It is landlords using the fact that Labor refuses to cap rent increases to drive up rents right now. In fact, even the RBA says that one of the principal drivers of the inflation crisis right now are skyrocketing rents. They are increasing at close to twice the rate of standard inflation. Labor could stop that by freezing and capping rent increases. They choose not to, and instead what they do is allow the Reserve Bank to jack up interest rates and punish ordinary and everyday people. And let's be clear, you might be watching this at home right now, stressed out of your mind about how you're going to meet your next month's mortgage repayment, stressed out of your mind about how you're going to cop another rent increase. And you're watching on the news, the Reserve Bank Governor, Michelle Bullock, is saying she doesn't foresee an interest rate cut in the next few months. And you might start to think, well, how is this my fault? You might start to think, well, maybe I need to cut back more. Well, maybe I should have done more to pay off my mortgage earlier. Maybe I should have worked harder. Don't think that, because the reality is that it is not your fault. It is not your fault. It is the fault of a political and economic system that always punishes ordinary and everyday people, always chooses to punish them and allows big corporations to get away making massive corporate profits. Because in this same period, big corporations have made over $100 billion in crisis profits. That's according to Oxfam, $100 billion in crisis profits. That includes the National Australia Bank, it includes Woolworths. Those are institutions, financial institutions and big corporations who are making excess profits by using their monopoly and duopoly power to drive up prices and punish ordinary and everyday people. And here's how this economic system works. First, you have a big set of big corporations, banks, Woolworths, Coles. They drive up prices, taking advantage of their enormous economic power. That drives up prices and that drives up inflation. And then what happens when inflation gets high is, well, the Reserve Bank kicks into gear and says, well, the way we're going to tackle this is put up interest rates. And the effect of putting up interest rates is punishing mortgage holders and renters. And what their intention is, and let's be very clear about this, is what they are doing is pushing mortgage holders and renters into financial pain to reduce their capacity to spend money in the economy. And they claim that this somehow will decrease inflation. But let's talk about what they're decreasing spending on. Food, rent, health, housing costs, food for their kids. When I was running a free meal program earlier this year, we had a nice family come up to us at one of these free dinner programs. Dressed very nicely, they sat down with us, they were eating one of our free dinners. And I asked them, well, why are you here? And I thought maybe they were here just to talk to me about some issues in their local community. They had 2 young kids with them, living in Carina Heights. And they turned to me and said, well, look, to be honest, any night where we don't have to fork out and pay to feed our kids is another night we're more likely to meet our mortgage payments. That shouldn't be happening in a wealthy country like Australia. That should not be happening in a wealthy country like Australia. And politics is about choices. There is no political or economic reason or technical reason why we couldn't force the Reserve Bank to cut interest rates right now. And the effect of cutting interest rates right now, a real plan to tackle inflation, could be cutting interest rates, relieving pressure on mortgage holders, allowing them and renters, allowing them to feed their kids and not have to make tough choices, not be forced to sell their homes, which is the solution that Michelle Bullock, the Reserve Bank Governor, said they might have to do. Instead, what we could do is crack down on price gouging on supermarkets. We could tax the super profits of big corporations and force them and punish them for price gouging ordinary Australians. We could use that revenue to provide dental and mental health into Medicare, incentivising the states to freezing and capping rent increases. Indeed, one of the best ways to tackle inflation right now is to cap rent increases. One of the key drivers of the inflation crisis is rents. We could do that, and we could relieve pressure on millions of people. But why is it in this country that it's always ordinary and everyday people that have to pick up the pieces of an economic system they're not responsible for? Why is it always that there's a single mum in this country having to choose between feeding her kids and paying the rent, while the Commonwealth Bank records a $9.69 billion profit? Why is it that in the middle of one of the worst housing crises we have seen in this country's history, while there are millions of people struggling to meet their mortgage payments or their rents, why is it precisely at that moment that the Commonwealth Bank can come out and record over a $9 billion profit? $9 billion profit. Imagine what we could do with $9 billion. We could bring dental into Medicare. We could bring mental health into Medicare. We could put a down payment on bringing back free university and scrapping student debt. We could invest in building enough public housing. Instead, it's going into the profit margins of the Commonwealth Bank, who make those profits because the Reserve Bank has put up interest rates, driving up mortgage costs that allow those big four banks to price gouge ordinary Australians, make more off mortgages, make more off that human misery, and screw over ordinary Australians. The Greens are fighting hard to protect the current power that the federal government has to override the Reserve Bank of Australia and cut interest rates, because that is an important element of a democracy. What interest rates are charged is a fundamental economic question in this country, and that should be subject to democratic review. And I would argue in what Labor is attempting to do in scrapping the power that they have right now to override the Reserve Bank is wash their hands of the responsibility of one of the key decisions in this economy and in our economy, and pretend like they have nothing to do with it. But let's be very, very clear. In refusing to override the Reserve Bank of Australia, in attempting to get rid of that power, what they are doing is endorsing a political and economic system that time and again asks the people that are already doing it tough to suffer more, while bankers and big corporations and politicians benefit by the billions of dollars.
And I thank the member for Griffith for his contribution. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I spoke last month about Labor's Future Made in Australia bill and likened it to Labor's use of the term Made in Australia to Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice in Disney's 1940 classic Fantasia. In the story, Mickey, as the incompetent apprentice, takes the magician's wand and inadvertently animates mops, buckets and furniture, and in the process creates chaos in the wizard's tower. Labor's Mickey Mouse apprenticeship is on full display as described by the Independent Reserve Bank of Australia, who called out Labor government spending as driving the rising cost of living. Australia is the only major economy where inflation is rising, not falling. Labor's homegrown inflation crisis, thanks to the $315 billion of spending, mostly on big government agenda items, and equivalent to $30,000 more per household since they took office, is incredible. Household disposable income is heading south, when in comparable economies, household income is heading north. My constituents in Mallee are feeling that cost of living pain acutely. We are living in Labor's homegrown cost of living crisis, and no amount of waving of wands, press conference trickery, TP tactics or pulling spending rabbits out of hats will convince the Australian public that this government has a fiscal clue with what it is doing. Thankfully, Mickey's Fantasia mess is cleaned up when the wise wizard returns to set everything aright. The Coalition's role has ever been thus in Australian politics, righting Labor's economic chaos. My hope is sooner rather than later. The Coalition does not support this bill. We worked on a bipartisan position for over 18 months, but we are now at a point where, as the Shadow Treasurer said this week, we need certainty and stability at the Reserve Bank, not more change. The RBA is under unprecedented attack from this Albanese Labor government and some of their proxies in the retired Labor operative space, as I will go into later. Even Gough Whitlam acknowledged the need for his ministers to fly economy, not first class, during a cost of living crisis his government faced. This Labor government would make Gough Whitlam blush. Such is Albanese Labor government's bluster, trickery and gaslighting of Australians. The Coalition believes in a stable, credible and independent Reserve Bank of Australia. The independent RBA has hiked the cash rate 11 times on Labor's watch. Their last cash rate hike was over 300 days ago, on 8th of November 2023, yet Labor want to shift the blame that they are somehow smashing the economy. The RBA is smashing the economy. With Labor's abysmal track record for picking winners, the last thing that we want is for Labor to stitch up the Reserve Bank board.
They've wrecked other government institutions with government appointments and with a huge cloud over Labor's connections with the disgraced CFMEU and questionable operatives in industry super. The Coalition are very cautious about letting sack and stack Labor pick the team when Coach Chalmers is taking Australians to the bottom of the cost of living global ladder. We on this side of the House have serious questions.
I would remind the member for Mallee to refer to the Treasurer by his title, please.
The Treasurer. We on this side of the House have serious questions about how committed the Albanese government is to the continued independence of the Reserve Bank of Australia. The Treasurer and the Prime Minister every day demonstrate they are more focused on fighting others and shifting blame than fighting their homegrown cost of living crisis. The Treasurer is trying to fight and pin blame for his own economic woes onto the Reserve Bank, the opposition leader, the Productivity Commission, the laws of economics, or even his hero and old mentor Paul Keating over superannuation taxes. The Prime Minister, members of the government frontbench and Labor-aligned commentators like Stephen Conroy, Stephen Koukoulas joined in like children whacking a panata, hoping the lollies of public support would fall out for them. On Friday, ALP President Wayne Swan said he was very disappointed in the Reserve Bank and that it was punching itself in the face. This is the same man who, in his stint as Treasurer, projected budget surpluses but never delivered one. The Rudd-Swan government were masters at converting black into red, net savings into net debt. Labor's frothing and loathing directed at the RBA really exposes that they can't handle the truth. Rather than take responsibility, what a novel concept, responsible government, Labor goes around attacking the truth tellers, threatening them with consequences for speaking the truth. They stack and undermine our independent institutions. They force those that come in good faith to negotiate with the government, even priests, to sign non-disclosure agreements. One senior Labor figure has reportedly described the RBA to the ABC recently as barbarians and weirdos in the thrall of a bizarre group think, and that the Reserve Bank Chair Michelle Bullock is a nutter, this brave, unnamed source said. This is all coming from a Labor government fighting everything but inflation. A government that attacks the Leader of the Opposition for his truth-telling on the cost of living and accuses him to be the bad guy for telling the truth. Perhaps the truth bombs from the RBA hit their mark the best when they criticised government spending as a driver of Labor's homegrown inflation crisis. After some pointed criticisms from the government, the RBA explained their comment was also directed at state governments. In my home state of Victoria, sadly, Labor has done incredible damage, not only to Victoria's economy, but you're dragging down the national economy while they do it. This is the same Victorian Labor government that, to use popular Labor phrase, smashed the economy in Victoria by making Melbourne the lockdown capital of the world. The Victorian Labor government is so inept it got re-elected on a promise to host the Commonwealth Games, then embarrassed Victoria and the nation after the election by admitting they couldn't actually afford to host it after all. It took a Freedom of Information request to unearth that June last year, the Victorian Health Minister, Mary-Ann Thomas, wrote to Treasurer Palace urging for an urgent bailout to save the state hospitals. It gets worse, Deputy Speaker. Victorian Labor's priority primary care centres were rebranded urgent care centres recently, and hey presto, Mickey Mouse, the apprentice Labor here in Canberra, came along and bailed out the clinics, saying the Commonwealth will now run them. It should be bad enough that the Albanese Labor government is fighting everyone but the cost of living crisis. Now they are running a protection racket for the spend-happy Victorian Labor by bailing them out of their own mess. Getting answers out of the secretive Allan Labor government about their fiscal standing is just as hard as getting the Albanese Labor government to admit its economic missteps and take responsibility for their cost of living crisis. This Albanese Labor government are not only at war with institutions, it is at war with the overwhelming opinion of eminent economists as well. RMIT economics professor Sinclair Davidson said, and I quote, "All the economic indicators are going the wrong way." And what is the government doing? Fighting with the RBA. Former RBA board member Warwick McKibben said, and I quote, "You want to think that the government and the central bank are working together in the same direction for the benefit of the country. To make those sort of comments suggests that maybe there's some other agenda at work, and that's not helpful." Another former RBA board member, Graham Craigie, said, and I quote, "For the Treasurer to then be coming out and saying, well, this is the Reserve Bank's fault, I don't think another serious economist in the country would agree with that." Warren Hogan said, and I quote, "We are going backwards in terms of our living standards. Our productivity is falling, our government is growing, and if this is our new economy, then our standards of living as one of the world's wealthiest countries is going to go away. But bigger government is not what delivered modern wealth." EY chief economist Cheryl Murphy added, and I quote, "The lack of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy means the path to low and stable inflation and therefore lower interest rates is slower than it needs to be." KPMG chief economist Dr. Brendan Ryan had this to say, and I quote, "The public sector has its foot on the accelerator and the Reserve Bank's foot is on the brake. It's stalling the economy. In effect, we're in no man's land. Government spending is not sustainable and is effectively taking from Peter to pay Paul. While there's this idea that government spending has saved the economy, what it's effectively done is just move the deck chairs around." Picking up on what Dr. Ryan said there, the chatter here in Canberra is that there'll be a May election and an early budget in, say, March. This May, the Treasurer predicted inflation would come back into the RBA's target range of 2 to 3% by Christmas. I don't want to scare you, Deputy Speaker, but it's only 105 days till Christmas. And the RBA is only meeting 3 more times before Christmas under Labor's reduced meeting schedule. My fear is that Labor's pre-election budget will spend, baby spend, because it's all Labor knows what to do. If you think the Albanese government are clawing at the institutions, economists and other truth-tellers now, wait until inflation isn't back into the target range by Christmas and the RBA hasn't cut rates. The Albanese government have gone past the denial stage of their fiscal grief cycle and now they are in the anger stage. They are lashing out verbally at truth-tellers, lashing out at the Leader of the Opposition for standing shoulder to shoulder with hard-working Australians struggling to make ends meet. And it gets uglier from here if the Treasurer's Nostradamus predictions on inflation don't come true by Christmas. Voters may have some lumps of coal ready for the Treasurer's stocking. Just like the economists, the numbers don't lie either, Deputy Speaker. Last week, national accounts show the slowest GDP growth since the 1990s outside the pandemic. Australia has reported its 6th consecutive quarter of negative GDP per person growth, the longest per capita recession in 50 years. In May 2022, the former coalition government left an economy with low unemployment, strong growth and recovering government finances, yet Labor have wasted it. Living standards, real disposable income per capita, have fallen by 8.7%, productivity has collapsed to 6.3%, household savings are down 10.2 percentage points, personal income taxes are 25.3% higher, interest rate paid on mortgages has almost tripled, the economy is experiencing the slowest GDP growth since the 1990s outside the pandemic. A Peter Dutton-led coalition government will get Australia back on track with Back to Basics economic agenda. We will deliver strong economic management that fights inflation and boosts productivity. We are absolutely focused on restoring Australians' way of life. Winning the fight against inflation is the only way to ease the cost of living pressures Australians are facing now. The Coalition will boost productivity, bringing essential fiscal discipline to bring down inflation and restoring Australia's standard of living. The Coalition will get Australia back on track by delivering a back-to-basic economic agenda that includes cutting red tape, securing our energy future, reforming our tax system, restoring sensible workplace laws, encouraging enterprise and small business, supporting a strong financial sector. That is how we will restore our standard of living and ensure future prosperity.
And I thank the member for Mallee. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I'll give the call to the Treasurer.
Very good of you, Deputy Speaker. Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the members who've made a contribution to this debate about some very important issues and a really key economic institution, and for the opportunity to sum up the debate for the Treasury Laws Amendment Reserve Bank Reforms Bill 2023. This bill will strengthen the Reserve Bank's independence, it will clarify its mandate and modernise its structures. It will deliver the biggest set of reforms undertaken at the Reserve Bank in over 3 decades, and it will implement the government's response to the independent review of the Reserve Bank of Australia. That review received input from current and former RBA board members and staff and others. It considered international best practice and it canvassed views from across the community. And I wanted to thank again the review panel, some wonderful people, Professor Carolyn Wilkins, Professor Renee Fry-McKibben and Dr Gordon de Brouwer, PSM, for their work, and also to the more than 1,500 stakeholders who contributed to the review process. I released the review and its recommendations almost 18 months ago now, and I welcome the discussion and debate that has occurred since then. We've already made some progress on implementation, and here I wanted to acknowledge the efforts of the Reserve Bank, led by Governor Bullock, in following through on many of the recommendations that go to its own internal operations. And as part of our response, I've also agreed an updated statement on the conduct of monetary policy with the RBA board. That was released in December last year, and I thank the board members for their engagement with that as well. This legislation before us is the next step in implementing the review. The Reserve Bank Governor has said herself that she is 100% behind the changes that are being proposed. She has publicly called on them to be legislated, and that means that opponents of this legislation are at odds with the public position taken by the Reserve Bank Governor. Our response to this extensive piece of work is in keeping with its recommendations to strengthen the RBA's independence, to clarify its role and modernise its structure, as I said. In a little bit more detail, the bill amends the Reserve Bank Act 1959 and the Banking Act 1959 to reinforce the Reserve Bank's independence in the operation of monetary policy, renew the bank's statutory objectives, improve accountability and transparency in the bank's monetary policy decision-making, enhance the bank's governance arrangements to bring them into line with best practice, and clarify the RBA's responsibility to contribute to financial system stability. As I said, we welcome the discussion and debate that has occurred in the House and in the broader community since my second reading speech in November of last year. Many MPs have highlighted, as I do again, the critical role the Reserve Bank has played in our economic success for well over 6 decades now. They've recognised how important it is that we equip the bank to continue serving all Australians in an increasingly complex and challenging economic environment. And they've accepted the review and the government's response to it as the best way forward. Deputy Speaker, at every stage I've done my best to reach a bipartisan consensus on the changes before the House. I've always wanted this bill to be widely supported, broadly supported, and for that support to include the major governing parties in this place. And as a demonstration of my bona fides in this regard, I wanted to remind the House that the Coalition, via the member for Hume, have raised 6 issues over the past year, and we've responded to each of those 6 issues in good faith. Whenever there's been a line ball call, whenever there's been a view put to me by the opposition, we've accommodated that view. They wanted the chair of the governance board to be the governor, and we facilitated that. They wanted flexibility in term limits, and we facilitated that as well. They wanted senior RBA executives to have oversight of the operation of the bank. The bill makes the Deputy Governor a member of the Governance Board. They wanted to ensure that the dual mandate should exclude references to equal weight, and so the legislation and the statement on conduct and monetary policy, I agreed with the RBA Board late last year, doesn't mention equal weight for the dual mandate. They asked that Section 11 be retained. We proposed an amendment that would have retained Section 11 but focused it more appropriately. They asked that all current members of the RBA board should move to the Monetary Policy Board, and we proposed an amendment that would transfer all current board members to the Monetary Policy Board unless that was not their preference. But instead of being able to garner enough support for these changes that responded to his concerns and his suggestions, the member for Hume was rolled once again. I dealt with him in good faith. I engaged extensively with him. I had 3 face-to-face meetings. I organised multiple briefings for him with my department and with the review team for the best part of 2 years. I put a premium on bipartisanship, but there is only so much you can do when you're dealing with someone who doesn't carry the necessary authority amongst his own colleagues. The Coalition have had every opportunity to support this important economic reform, and it's more than disappointing that at the last moment they have not. So, Deputy Speaker, our preference has always been, and it continues to be, for bipartisanship between the 2 major governing parties on these issues. That's because I think that these issues and these changes should endure beyond any future changes of government. And we will continue to do our best to ensure a bipartisan outcome. Now, I was planning to move our amendments in the House today as they directly address concerns raised by the Coalition, but unfortunately, in light of the position that they announced yesterday, we will not be moving the amendments in the House today. Instead, as you'd expect, we will be considering our options and considering next steps. We are still willing to work across the Parliament to help these important reforms get through. We are still committed to the passage of these reforms. We anticipate and we flag for honourable members that we will have to move amendments in the Senate to secure further support. It is not our preference, and I say this respectfully to the member for Griffith, it's not our preference to accommodate the Greens on this, but the Coalition may force our hand. The government is committed to strengthening the independent Reserve Bank in an increasingly complex and changing world. Our reforms are timely, they are measured, and they should be enduring. Because to support sustainable growth in our economy and to support a better future, we need an RBA that is transparent and strong and independent, an RBA that draws on more expertise to make its important decisions, an RBA that is at the forefront of international best practice, an RBA that remains world-class. And that's what these reforms are all about, and that's why I commend the bill to the House.
And I thank the Treasurer. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. There being no further speakers, I'll put the question. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration, and we'll now go straight to the adjournment. I give the call to the member for Spence.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
Is the motion seconded? And I thank the member for Forrest. The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, Thursday the 12th of September.